Hi everyone and welcome to In Deep Geek Live. This is the latest in a series of overviews I've been doing of the world of the Lord of the Rings. We've been starting off all the way back in the history, the creation of Arda of Middle-earth, and then coming through age by age. And now we sort of reached the culmination, the third age of Middle-earth, which is that time period that we probably know the best, time period where The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are set. And there's a lot in there. So I'm delighted to say that as I've been trying to do, I've been trying to bring in content creators from the wider world of the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, people that you may not have come across their channel before, but I would personally recommend. And I would like to introduce you to Chris, the Philosopher's Games. Do you want to say hi?
Hi everyone, nice to be here. It's an honor to be here with you on your channel and talking a bit about Lord of the Rings. My channel is called The Philosopher's Games. I'm Chris and I do long lore videos.
You do, as well as doing breakdowns about particular issues and lore and history. You do we were talking about this briefly before we went on air. You do some of the most epically long live streams in the world, as far as I can tell. If you think I go on long sometimes, this guy here, I saw one that went for 5.5 hours, and he could have gone on for longer.
It's kind of a bad habit, I think.
I think it's a good habit. As long as you have the content and as long as you've got stuff in there, it's pretty good. Okay, well let's what I start at the beginning of all of these live streams just to try and give a flavour of anything that's happening in the wider fantasy world in this last week. Not much has happened. Everything's a bit quiet because the Wheel of Time is going on. Wheel of Time episode 6 will be out when this live stream finishes. I've been told that if you're a fan of Wheel of Time, this is Brandon Sanderson's favorite episode coming up. So I feel it's been gaining a whole load of speed. It's been really starting to get quite good. I'm really looking forward to episode 6 coming up later. And in about a week's time, 8 days' time, we have The Witcher season 2, which I'm going to be covering in quite a lot of detail on this channel, and indeed next week's live stream I will be looking at The Witcher. So that's something, if you're a fan of The Witcher, that's something to be looking forward to. Just a quick super chat I just saw there from Fifi Trixabel saying, "All hail Chris the Lawmaster." So you clearly have a fan in there already.
Yeah. Shout out to Trixabel.
Excellent. So what we'll do is, just to start off with, is to give a broad overview. I try and do this as sort of a very high level, what happened in the Third Age. I'll give my high level overview, and then Chris, perhaps you can pick up on the things that I've missed out on, or some things that you might want to emphasize. This is Marley, I should say thank you for your questions over on Patreon. You had a few questions asking about what was the start of it, what was the end of it, what were the different kingdoms. So I'll try and cover all of that in this overview to start with. The Third Age starts basically once the battle we saw at the very beginning of the Lord of the Rings films, that battle when we had Sauron was overthrown, the ring was cut from his finger, Isildur claims it, and then Isildur dies. That marks the end of the Second Age into the Third Age, and from that moment onwards we have 3,000 or so years. I think it's 3,021 years in total is the Third Age. The overarching themes of the Third Age are the rise and fall of the two great Numenorian kingdoms, Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south, and then the slow rise of Sauron, culminating in the events that we have in the stories of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In the north, we have Arnor. That was where Isildur was going to be reigning from. He never made it that far north, but then his descendants ruled there. That was beset by internal politics and bickering. It broke down into 3, and then eventually it just had this whole series of problems coming at it, led by Angmar, this great kingdom which grew up. The Witch King of Angmar, they didn't know who it was at the time, but this was the chief Nazgul, the leader of the Nazgul, who was there taking down the Númenórean kingdom one by one, just getting rid of them. And that worked. It took quite a long time, but that worked. Switching down to the south, Gondor had the line of kings as well. They also traced it, but from Isildur's brother, they traced their line down. They grew to actually quite great heights. There was a point when what they were achieving, we're told, was reminiscent of Númenor. But they too started to fall down. There was this series of great calamities that happened to them. 3 in particular, Tolkien notes that happened. The first kin strife, it's called the kin strife, basically a Gondorian civil war over succession. Secondly, there was a great plague which killed huge amounts of people, and then thirdly, an attack from the Easterlings, the Wain Riders, and that just really pushed Gondor down to a position where it was incredibly weak. Their last king rather foolishly accepted a one-on-one challenge from the Witch King, and he died. The stewards, as we know, then took over and effectively ruled it as kings, although always saying that they were waiting for the return of the king. They ruled it all going on. During this time, the other parts of the world that we should probably note, Rohan came into existence about 500 years before the time of the Lord of the Rings. They occupied that land, as we know, just sort of to the northwest of Gondor. Also, the elves had a very long, slow decline. One by one, they started drifting away. The dwarves, they were just doing their dwarvy thing, although they did have this big war with the elves partway through. And the build-up of all of this behind the scenes, that Sauron is coming back into power. It took him 1,000 years before he could really start to get a base again. He based himself in Dol Guldur in South Mirkwood, and then eventually, as we know, he got pushed out of there, goes back to Mordor, and then we start coming into the events that we know in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So that is my overview of the Third Age. Chris, do you want to highlight the things that I missed out there? It was quite high level, but what do you think are the important things that we might want to focus on?
I think you did a very good job mentioning all the major big events. There, of course, you can go into a lot of detail in all of this. I think maybe one thing that sticks out to me personally a lot is the secret return of Sauron. I think Third Age 1050, if I remember correctly, and hiding in Dol Guldur. And that is, in my opinion, a very interesting point, because somewhat similar also the hobbits appear. And that is, in my opinion, just a very nice, let's call it a coincidence in the lore. Yeah, 1050 is right. I remembered correctly. And that is, the hobbits play such a, how to say it, just big players, if you want, in the Third Age, at least later on, and become so important in so many things. I think Bilbo finding the One Ring is, in my opinion, one of the most important events of the whole Third Age. And that is, a very interesting incident, that Sauron reappearing basically in the, let's say, more western part of Middle-earth, and then the hobbits also show up. I think that's such a genius little coincidence that Tolkien likes to put into his lore.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I would agree that that is the big event, and it was overlooked by most people, and most people didn't even know that the hobbits existed or where they were. But this migration of the hobbits away from where they started, because of the wars and because of the growing of the shadow in Mirkwood, that pushed them across westwards. ultimately, there is some irony there. Ultimately, it was Sauron's presence that led to the
Yes.
hobbits being where they were, which led ultimately to his downfall. So, so there's certainly an irony there. The clueless Fangle I see is in the chat. Hi there, Helen.
Yeah.
Hi, which
Helen.
is this is actually, I'll put a random question to you. Is Tolkien quite big in Germany? Because there seem to be quite a lot of German Tolkien enthusiasts.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think I talked with Helen about it, and she mentioned that I think the German Tolkien Society is also the second biggest one. So,
wow.
And for my personal environment, I would say, yeah, there are a lot of people who really like Tolkien a lot. It definitely has a good resonance. We have even 2 translations in Germany. One is often a bit criticized, and the older one is usually, I think, more popular, but that's a topic for itself, I guess. And I think the translator, she contacted or had contact with Tolkien. There are some letters. I think they also published somewhere. And it's kind of, really definitely a big thing, though. But in my private environment, a lot of people really like the films, but very like nobody goes as deep into it as for example I do, and as a result I often have a lot of room for talking about it, so I'm happy to be here again.
Excellent. Well, it's a delight to have you here. Let's go to a question from Lyle Hammock in the chat saying, hello, gentlemen. What do you believe happens if Galadriel accepted the ring from Frodo? What would she do? How would her plan, how would it all play out in your opinion? Thank you for all you do. Well, thank you, Lyle. I've got some questions from you from Patreon as well, which we will get to in a moment. Chris, I'll throw this one to you first. It's a really dramatic moment in the books, as well as obviously they did it, I thought, fantastically in the film. When Galadriel, she passes the test, Frodo offers her the ring, she says no. But what do you think would have happened if she had accepted the ring?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think it's discussed always a lot. What would happen if person X takes the One Ring? I think the outcome is always somewhat similar in a way, because the One Ring, like, it still contains the will of Sauron, and it's a complicated topic. I don't want to go too deep into this, but Tolkien has this concept he calls the machine, and this is basically like a philosophical idea, and it's basically, he describes it as a shortcut to power, and this would basically be the same for Galadriel. She is already very powerful, but with a One Ring, her options suddenly increase, and she gets this shortcut to even more power. And then she, as she says, she would be like a dark queen, and terrible and beautiful, and so on. And depending on what she is going for, I think Sauron is also a character who really wants to bring like his idea of order over Middle Earth. Saruman also has a very similar approach to it. How it is for Galadriel is not that easy to say, I think, but I assume it would be also similar. She might have a certain view of the world. She basically lives in Lothlorien, and through the power of the ring she already possesses, she is of course able to protect this and basically create an elven space inside Middle Earth, which is so much under pressure by through the Dark Lord and so on. And in addition, elves also have this desire to leave Middle Earth because their basic nature is in disharmony with how Middle Earth functions. They need to be at a different place on the west continent of Aman, where things don't change that much. It's called the Undying Lands for a reason, and that is why elves sail there at some point to just escape this conflict, this disharmony with the world itself. As a result, I would assume she would try to create this kind of harmony within the world, maybe using the One Ring, creating a new order, and prolonging her stay in Middle Earth this way artificially. But this would ultimately still clash with her basic essence as a being, and that would probably torment her and not end well and twist her in many ways after who knows how many years. And I think that is basically what happens. What she's doing with the One Ring. In addition, she has, of course, a lot of influence. She could gather a lot of powerful elven lords around her, which slowly leaving. Maybe she could even convince her by changing, or as she thinks she would change the world, by also convincing other elves staying in Middle-earth. Probably not others to return, but as a result, yeah, the whole story would be very different, I think, from that point on if she would take the One Ring.
Yeah, I would agree absolutely, and I think it's quite it's quite worth noting what Galadriel's character arc here is, because she starts out. We see her as this great and wise and benevolent person, but she starts out wanting to rule. That's what drives her to Middle-earth in the first place. She doesn't. If you think all the way back to one of the earlier history live streams I did, when we were talking about when the elves left Valinor and headed, the Noldor elves left Valinor and headed over to Middle-earth under Feanor. Feanor had his reasons for going. She went along with that whole movement, but it wasn't because she agreed with Feanor. It's because she wanted to go to Middle-earth and rule a land of her own. And that, I think, is the key to understanding the power of what happened then when she was offered the ring and rejected it, because she had within her this desire for power. She had within her this desire to rule, to be in charge. And it was only after thousands of years, having actually ruled a land and having grown older and wiser, that she could then reject that. So I think that the ring would have found something to tap into if she had been wearing it. This kind of lust for power that she had originally, I think it would probably have tapped into that, and she would have ruled a bigger and wider land than she did in Lothlorien, and she would think that she was the right person to do it.
Yeah.
So go on.
It's a very good point. She, I think it's in Unfinished Tales, or it's in the Silmarillion. I think Unfinished Tales. There's also the mention that she does not want to live under the, I hope I pronounce the word right, I never say it in English, tutelage, I think it is pronounced. And of the Valar when she leaves Aman, and as you pointed out, she definitely has this desire to rule, have her own realm basically, and live there. So you're right. The ring would have had definitely find something in her that it could use to twist her into that way. And just for completeness sake, as always, you talked about the beginning of how she left and her potential idea, and she left with Feanor and so on. It's so interesting. Maybe many people don't know this, but Tolkien really changed the character and the backstory of Galadriel a lot. So there are so many versions of the old Galadriel. So there's one version, for example, where she leaves before Feanor in a ship with her husband. So she's not part of all of the Tolkien tried in some versions to basically extract her a bit from this Fëanorian endeavor, let's call it that way. But yeah, just as a side note.
Yes. It's always with Galadriel. It's quite interesting in the Book of Unfinished Tales. Christopher Tolkien, who does a marvelous job, he sort of starts this chapter about Galadriel and Celeborn and saying, out of all of the different bits of information my father left, the most confusing story to try and pick together is the story of Galadriel and Celeborn. So because Tolkien seemed to have changed his mind so many times. We have a question from Carl Johnson saying, how different, this is another what-if question, how different would the events of the Third Age be if the line of Narion never fails? So this is, Narion, I mentioned earlier, Isildur's brother. Just to set this into context, when leaving Numenor, we had Elendil, who had two sons, Isildur and Narion. He ended up in the north. He founded the Kingdom of Arnor. Kingdom of Gondor initially was jointly ruled by Isildur and Narion. And then Isildur, after Elendil and Anarion both died, Isildur headed north to take over his father's kingdom, and then the line of Anarion they were the rulers of Gondor. So when we say, talking about the line of Anarion failing, this is basically what happened with the changing from having a king to having stewards. Now, I will give a short, pithy answer to this that I would love you to react to. My take is, I don't think this would make huge amounts of difference to the story of the latter half of the history of Gondor if the line of Anarion, the line of kings, had carried on rather than stewards. But what's your take? Do you think that having a king rather than a steward would make a difference?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It would probably not make that much of a difference. And in a way, the fail of the line of Anarion must happen because it was prophetized to fail. There is if it's very complicated in a way. It's really complicated to summarize this in short words. So there is, as we have heard at the beginning in your introduction, there is Gondor and Arnor. So Gondor in the south, Arnor in the north, and in the north, in Arnor, Isildur's line continues after Elendil's death, and in Gondor, as said, Anarion's line is the other kings, and there is a point in time. There's the last king of Arnor, or also that is also not 100% correct, of Arthedain, but let's call it just Arnor for the time being to just not confuse people. His name was Arvedui, and that means last king. And he had a prophecy, that's how he got to this name, that there should be like a decision of the Dunedain, so the men of the West that are the Númenórean exiles, so the people living in Gondor and Arnor, and those had to decide what they do, and if they would take him as their king, basically, then things would go out well, and if they would not take him as king, there would be problems. And this exactly is what happens. They don't take him as king. He's the last king, and he marries a woman, Firiel, and she is from the line of kings of Gondor. So a distant relative of her, if you want, a very distant relative. And so those lines cross there. And I think he even tries to claim the kingship of Gondor, because Arvedui should be said that he's the last king, and he loses his kingship over Arnor. And as a result, Gondor, he writes to Gondor a letter and says, I'm from the line of Elendil, and I have married Firiel, and so on, the daughter of one of the last kings. It's also complicated. So this king had also sons. They died in battle. And then the line continued with a, let's say, distant cousin, basically. And Gondor then also had to decide, after the death of the king and after Arvedui lost his kingdom, Arnor was basically destroyed completely through the Witch King. And they had to decide, take we this guy from Arnor, or take we our distant cousin from the old king who was very victorious in battle and so on. So he had definitely good arguments for him. Or do we take the other king, which was Eärnil? And they decided for Eärnil. And as a result, this prophecy then came to be, and the line of Anarion, Eärnil was also from the line of Anarion, must fail at this point, because prophecies are quite potent in Tolkien's universe. So the question is kind of interesting in that regard. If you say, what happened if Anarion's line did not fail? Then, this may be just my opinion, then I would say Arvedui would be king of Gondor. And then that would be the line of Isildur. So it's kind of interesting in this regard.
Yes, I mean, I think you could argue on that if you take that line of logic down, you could argue that the line did not fail. It's simply that they had this this debate about whether or not the daughter was in the right line, and Tolkien does he sets out in a reasonable amount of detail in. I think it was the appendices to the Lord of the Rings. This exchange of really quite legalistic exchange of letters between Gondor and Ardri, who says he says, yeah, I've married the daughter of the last king. Therefore, you know, if you go back technically all the way back to the Númenóreans, then you know. They allowed the daughter to inherit, so why not? And then they come back and say, well, no, but you see, we just do this through the line that we've got through Amandil and down, and then we've never gone with the women can inherit. So actually, no, that's not right. And they have this exchange, this legalistic exchange, until basically Gondor just go, nope, and just ignore the other letters. And from a modern perspective, I guess that's their right to decide who they want. This was like the Council of Gondor effectively saying, we don't want this person to rule us, we want this other person to rule us. So it is their right and decision to say who they want to rule them. But yeah, it is a very sort of odd kind of legalistic thing that Tolkien pointedly had in Númenor. He had it so they changed the law so that women could inherit, but then by the time they get over to Middle Earth, that seems to have been completely forgotten, and maybe if they had stuck by it, then the line wouldn't have fallen. But yeah, it's all a bit of what ifs.
Yeah, a lot.
Question from Lyle Hammock. Why do you think Sauron chose Mirkwood instead of the south when he had established a power base? Is it possible he had an idea where the ring was already? This is a really interesting question. So this is harking back to after the beginning of the Third Age. The ring is lost. Sauron is effectively disembodied. He loses all power. And then about 1,000 or so years later, he has got enough strength to start building up a power base. And he doesn't go back to where his base was before, down in Mordor. He sets up a new place in South Mirkwood. And the question is, why did he go there rather than back home? I think the thing you suggested about, did he have an inkling about where the ring was? I don't think he knew where the ring was, but I think that there was definitely a sort of a calling there, because this is a part of his soul, and so yes, there will definitely be an element of that going on there. I think I would add one other point, which is at the time, Mordor, this wasn't just like he's still got a whole load of orcs and all of his mates hanging around there. Gondor was at the height of its power, and Gondor was watching Mordor. It had watchtowers all the way around. It was keeping an eye, just thinking Sauron could return any time, and they were watching it like a hawk. If he'd gone there, they would have found out. It would have been known. Going to Mirkwood was a much cleverer move if he wished to remain away from the eyes of the wise, and if he wished to have time, which is what he needed, time to slowly gather his power. So that's my take. Chris, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's a very good point that you said, that that Mordor is also occupied by Gondor. This is before the Great Plague and before the kin strife that you mentioned in your introduction at the beginning. So at this time, in Mordor was still watched by Gondor, that Sauron would not return there, and he was not in the position yet to just go back there and say, hey, I'm back. And now I take it back in this place here and bring into a lot of trouble. That is not what's happening. There are multiple fortresses there. There are guards at the... Some people might have played the game Shadow of Mordor. That's also... the timeline is wrong, but the idea that Gondor has guards on the Black Gate is definitely that was the case, and there was one of the fortresses. I always have to think which name it was. Was it? I think it was Durthang, and then there's you know it from Lord of the Rings, Kiris Ungol, and they also built I think the Tower of the Teeth, Narhost and Karhost. That's also close to the Blackgate and so on. So there were multiple fortresses and soldiers in or around Mordor and watched over it. So returning there would not be a good idea. As you said, Gondor was still at the height of its power, and so he had to select a more secret approach. And I think it's a very interesting place to choose. I guess why he chose it is, that's a topic for an hour or something. There are many nuances to it that also have to do with when something was written and so on. But it's very fascinating that he chose Mirkwood, because it was relatively close to a lot of places. It was close to, for example, Erebor. It was close to of course, the elves living there that he maybe, depending on the version, pushed further north in the forest. So Thranduil, and if you see his father, Orofer as canon and so on, complicated topic. Then it was close to Lothlorien. It was close to the Misty Mountains. It was also far away enough from Gondor to not be into problem and not get into any problems. Also, other Norsemen lived there and so on. So it is, it's a very, very good place, basically in the middle, and it somewhat allows you to be secret there. If you know, it's like a dark, big forest. You can just be there, and when such a powerful entity like Sauron just appears somewhere, the world around him starts to change a bit, and suddenly creatures appear there, and there's some evil activity in the forest, and then the forest is also then renamed into Mirkwood. It also happens at this time, and he pushes out potentially the hobbits there. It's such an interesting place to be. To be honest, it's really fascinating.
It is, and it's also sort of halfway between his two camps, or what will be his two main camps of Angmar, and down sort of the beyond Mordor, with the Easterlings and sort of Harad and places like that. Those two areas are where the strongholds of his power are. So I think being sort of in the middle there makes a huge amount of sense. Sasuke, thank you for pointing out. Yes, I always forget to mention this, but if you are watching this live and you find it easier to watch on Twitch, this is also going out live on Twitch. So I'm not replying to any questions or anything that's over there. I'm just purely streaming it. So if you would find it easier to go and watch this on Twitch, then please do go and watch this on Twitch. Thank you very much. And Reflective Rambling just saying that I should call Learned Hands back and work with them for the legal themes of those exchanges. Yeah, for those who don't know, Learned Hands, they're not your lawyers, as they always try and point out. This is the Westerosi Bar Association, experts on law in the world of Ice and Fire, and I had them on probably a couple of years ago, and we worked through some very deep technical issues about succession and wills and marriage and a huge amount of other things, and in how that applies in Westeros and what that might mean for the story. I don't know whether they're Lord of the Rings fans, so maybe I could get them back on and try and work out the laws of succession in Numenor and its successor states. That would be quite an interesting discussion, I would have thought. But do check them out. It's excellent podcast and channel, Learned Hands podcast. I'm sure one of the moderators will put a link in the chat. Lyle Hammock saying, I was talking, thank you, Lyle, again, very kind. I was talking about Harad, not Mordor. He had many followers amongst the Haradrim and Easterlings. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. As you say, it's if he wanted to base himself at that moment in time where all of his supporters were, then I would agree with you completely that he would base himself down as sort of far around the Easterlings, Haradrim, somewhere over there. But at the same time, I think the arguments that we've set out for why he might want to be, and firstly why he might be drawn there, as you say, why he might be drawn to Mirkwood, but also strategically why he might want to place himself further north and away from the obvious place. I think it all makes sense. Let's go to a question.
In addition, can I
go
just
on.
add something? In addition, also he had somewhat control over Harad already and over the Easterlings, so he was already there basically. He just had to return to a place where he can make his next move, if that makes sense.
Yes, agreed. Carl Karsnock, you've given me a new word, simul stream. Is that what I'm doing? Am I simul streaming on Twitch? This is good. Thank you very much. I love new words. Let's go to a question from one of my patrons, Sebastian Schumala, saying, "Hi, Robert, and hello to our guest today. You are most welcome here, Philosopher's Games," he says.
Thank you.
I would agree with that completely. My question is about the Nazgul. Where were the other Nazgul, and what were they doing while the Witch King of Angmar waged his wars with Arnor? They seem strangely inactive. Were they in Mordor or in the east all of that time? I think the first time we hear about more than one Nazgul in one place is during the Siege of Minas Ithil around the year 2000. That gives us 2,000 years in which only the Witch King seems to have a goal and an agenda. You also asked about The Witcher, whether I'm excited for The Witcher Season 2. Yes, I am. I know that, Chris, you're not so much of a Witcher fan. Personally, I'm going to be watching it, and I'm going to be covering it in hopefully a reasonable amount of detail on this channel. So next week I have got on the Podcast of Surprise as my guest, and they if you don't know them, this is actually two friends of the channel and personal friends, great people. Aziz from History of Westeros and Kyle from Fandom Media will both be here. They are the Podcasters of Prize, and they will be talking through the Witcher Season 2, what we can expect, just running through, reminding us what happened in Season 1. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I cannot wait to sort of get into the detail of what's happening there. But let's go back to the Nazgul. Chris, why don't you take a first bash at this one? Where were Sebastian's absolutely right. There's not really much of a mention of the Nazgul for a couple of thousand years. What do you think they were up to?
Yeah, it's this was a question. You sent some of the Patreon questions beforehand, and I looked at this question and said, "Oh boy, that's a relatively tough to answer question, I think, because sometimes Tolkien has maybe some information somewhere in some half sentences, and then you have to find them, and that is kind of difficult. But out of my head, I think you basically described it right. There's not much we know about the Nazgul. The first mention, of course, of them is in the Second Age already. I think it's 2251 Second Age. And then not much happens with them. And then we have the, let's call it the arc about Angmar. And there, I actually looked it up again in Appendix B, what was going on there. And it basically says that only the Witch King goes there, and what is with the other ones, we don't really know. Of course, there's another mention that, for example, we talked about the last question about Sauron already, and his return to Mirkwood, and the wise assumed that, or thought that it might be one of the Nazgul who went to Dol Guldur, which might be true to some extent, I guess, but nothing really is known. Then there's the next in around Third Age, 1300, the Nazgul reappear. Nazgul should be plural, so it should mean all of them. It's black speech. It's a bit also complicated topic. And then it says, the chief of these comes north to Angmar. The Perianas, that are the hobbits, migrate westward, and so on. And it is, kind of interesting that it only says the chief of these comes to Angmar, not the others with him. Maybe you could argue, maybe the others came with the Witch King, and they're just not mentioned because there's also not that details, just very small nuances, small texts that we have about this time, at least if you exclude at least the unfinished tales. But still, it seems like this clearly states that the Nazgul were not around. Then, as you correctly say, only third age 2000, then the Nazgul are basically back. It says third age 1980. It says the Witch King comes to Mordor. There gathers the Nazgul, and then 2000 they issue from Mordor and besiege Minas Ithil. So that's basically all we know. What are they doing in the meantime? That's a really good question, and I have to admit, I think I can only really guess here what they might be doing. I think first, well, let's find a possible explanation why we don't know too much about them. So if the Nazgul don't wear their capes, they're basically invisible, and of course, it's kind of difficult to pinpoint somebody if he's invisible. I assume the Witch King becoming a king of a realm and taking it is even though you probably don't see him much physically, you still know he's there and he claimed it and people talk about him. That might be different for the other Nazgul that did maybe terrorize some other regions at that time, or maybe were active in the east. But sadly, we don't have any accounts. On top of that, sometimes you also have to look at the sources. It's kind of interesting. Tolkien really goes into this detail. Who wrote this down? How trustworthy is this source? And maybe usually the sources are written down by the elves or by the Gondorians or the Menorians and so on. These are the main people who write things down, and probably they were simply not appearing in their, let's say, radius of sight, if that makes sense. And as a result, we simply don't know what they were actively doing then. It seems like only the Witch King was active at this time in Angmar, and what the others did is, I think, pure speculation. Maybe there is like a hint somewhere, but I can't remember it out of my head. Maybe you have found something?
I haven't. I just wanted to give a very quick shout out. Smokescreen, hi there. I see you in the chat. For those who don't know, Smokescreen came up with me starting out doing Game of Thrones videos. Excellent YouTuber, covering, I'm sure, House of the Dragon now. I suspect probably will do The Witcher as well. And has also now got a book, which is just up there, which I shall show you in just one moment. But I have a thought for what they may have been up to. As you say, we do not know. Tolkien didn't, I think, as well as not saying what they were up to, he didn't even hint at what they were up to. But I have a bit of headcanon, which is that what was happening in the world at the time was not just a whole series of random events. This was a coordinated attempt by the Witch King on behalf of Sauron to be trying to take down the old Númenórean kingdoms, Arnor and Gondor. Now, half of that plan was up in the north, Arnor. The Witch King went up and slowly destroyed the three kingdoms of Arnor. In the south, the slow ebbing of Gondorian power was hit by three things. It was hit, first of all, by the Kinstrife, then it was hit by this great plague, and then it was hit by the Wainriders. Now, of those things, at least two, we're told, came from the east. The plague came in from the south and east. The Wainriders were effectively Easterlings who came in. This, to me, as I say, we're not told this, but the clear hint is that someone or something was directing events in the east to be sapping the strength of Gondor. So, given the fact that we know only one name of any of the Nazgul, a guy called Kamul the Easterling, we know that one of them was based around there at some point. Perhaps what was happening was that at least he, and the Witch King of Angmar didn't come from Angmar. He got called the Witch King of Angmar because of what he was doing in the Third Age. Perhaps Kamul the Easterling was doing things in the east in the Third Age as well, and maybe he was behind the Wain Riders, maybe he was behind this plague. As I say, Tolkien doesn't tell us, but it makes sense that this is not just a random series of events. This is a coordinated attempt. And in fact, actually, towards the end, when Arnor is breaking down and Gondor's really feeling the heat, they kind of get together, the kings, and go, this is not just coincidence. This smacks of something trying to get at us. But by that point, it was a bit too late to do anything. So that's my best guess. But I mean, what do you think on that, Chris? Does that kind of sound right?
Yeah, I think it totally sounds right. As you say, these three events that shook up Gondor a lot and the whole Third Age definitely are not random, and Tolkien carefully hints multiple times that Sauron and his servants might be behind this. There's more to it than just them randomly occurring to the perfect possible time. That is, of course, a thing. In addition, of course, somebody wrote in chat if the Nazgul killed the blue wizards. They did not kill them, as far as we know, though it's a complicated topic because multiple versions exist of this text and how successful they were. But there's also like a mention in one of those versions, for example, that after, well, it's not 100% clear when this exactly happened, but in the book Peoples of Middle-earth, we find a hint that the Blue Wizards tried to find the spirit of Sauron when he lost the One Ring after the siege of Barad-dûr in the whole war with the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, and tried to find him and confront him, I assume, because they, of course, also were basically in Middle-earth to oppose them. So it's an interesting point that you bring up there. So maybe they were also there helping their master against the Blue Wizards. But it's nowhere mentioned anywhere that this is the case. Just to be clear here, it's just also speculation. In addition, there's also another thing that is not that unimportant, I think, that Sauron at some point also returns back to Mordor. And if I remember correctly, maybe I'm wrong, maybe Robert knows it better than me, there is a mention that after the siege of Barad-dûr, it reads a bit like that it got at least damaged, though they could not undo the foundations of it because they are bound to the One Ring and it still existed. So they could not destroy those. As a result, I assume Mordor also needed a bit of rebuilding at this time. And so this was also, of course, as Robert already explained, we have the destroying Arnor with Angmar, and then pressuring Gondor with a plague and with a kin strife and so on. This also makes room. The kin strife, for example, opens the opportunity, or not the opportunity, but we can read that after it, Gondor neglects its guard over Mordor. And at this point, I assume the Nazgul could have been busy coordinating maybe the rebuild of Barad-dûr at this time, slowly preparing, even though we find like somewhere a hint like that they go to basically retreat back to Mordor and prepare it for Sauron's return, basically. And then at some point, he also returns there. And after Third Age 2000 somewhere, I forgot the exact date. And let me see. Yeah, the power of Dol Guldur grows. The wise. No, of course, he returns after parallel to the Hobbit, so much, much later. But definitely, there needs some preparation to be done. That's the whole point. And I think this also could take into play. So definitely, I agree with you 100% that there's definitely some indicator that the Nazgul might be needed in the East too, and do something there too. Maybe, as you say, Khamul the Easterling, or Khamul, however it's pronounced, difficult topic in of itself, the pronunciation of this name. And it's really fascinating. There are a lot of possibilities. Sadly, we don't have like a text that explicitly says to us, yeah, it was like that. that's not the case. The Peoples of Middle-earth text about the blue wizards, as said, has also several versions and so on. So what version you take for canon is always debatable, but I think the possibility definitely exists. So yeah, I'm with you there, Robert.
Excellent. I shall just use this as I did. Apologies, you probably saw me reaching for something. This absolutely beautiful cover. I'm sure you will agree. It's a really good read as well. That is Chris Smokescreen's book. So do go and check that out. I think if you're watching live, that Refractive Rambling put a link to it in the chat. Yeah. So just to round that one off, the other thing you mentioned, the Blue Wizards. I think the fact that the Blue Wizards were sent to the east or went to the east implies that clearly there was something going on there which is just off camera, off screen. And let's not forget Saruman. We think of him as being based in Orthanc. He was only based in Orthanc in the last a few hundred years of the Third Age. For most of it he was actually off to the east as well. So most of the Astari were based off in the east because that was where they were needed to foil Saruman's plans. Okay, let's go to another question from one of my patrons, James Horner, saying, "Hi, Robert. Listening to your videos makes sitting in traffic on the way to work so much more interesting." Well, that makes me very happy. My question is, why didn't the Balrog drive the dwarfs from Moria? They seem to have carried on living there after they woke it up, at least until the orcs killed them all. Also, do you have a theory on why technology advanced so slowly in Middle-earth? We'll get onto technology in just one moment. Do you want to have a first bash at this, the Balrog and the dwarves? Because the dwarves, they were... well, do you want to give your take on the sort of the chronology and why there were periods where the dwarves were there, particularly under Balin, and the Balrog appears not to have been there or do things?
I originally thought about this question from the perspective of when they initially woke it up, but you mean...
Well, why don't you do that, and then I'll pick it up for later. So when they,
Okay.
So when they initially do that, and then I'll pick up the Balin bit and my take on what's going on there.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so Moria, of course, was once, I would say, the dwarven kingdom. There, a certain house of the dwarves, the Longbeards, and of course Durin, were the line of kings there and founded it. And basically, he got that's also a complicated topic. He got one of the Elven Rings of Power ones, one of the 7 in the Lord of the Rings. It is stated that the dwarves believe that they got it at the time they were forged and not later. That's just as a side note. And however, he at some point, one of the line of Durin had this ring of power, and what we can read, it had basically no effect on them except that they made them a bit more greedy for example, gold, and everything else to them seemed then less valuable, and they tried to as a result, it potentially led to them, as we also I think it's also well explained in the films. They dug too deep at some point, and then they found somebody, a Balrog of Morgoth, as Legolas would say, and he woke up. He hid there. Balrogs were the servants of the first Dark Lord, so the original master of Sauron, called Morgoth, and they were basically on the hierarchy similar to Sauron. So they were very, very powerful beings, each of them, but with a different purpose. They're more like Morgoth's warriors, while Sauron was more his sorcerer, if that makes sense. And the Balrogs were Morgoth was defeated at the end of the First Age after the War of Wrath, and then the surviving ones, which were just a few, at least in the later versions, in the very early versions, there were armies of Balrogs and so on, but he reduced them later. Basically, he said quality instead of quantity, and then there were only like 5 or 7 or something like this, but they were strong as an army each, basically. And the surviving ones hid there, and then one of them said, "Hey, it's probably a good hiding place to hide in the Misty Mountains deep under the earth," and that is where the dwarves found them. It should be noted that the Misty Mountains itself was once raised by also Morgoth to basically build like some kind of wall against the other high power. So but you could compare. There's basically an pantheon of gods that are, to be precise, more like high angels. They're called the Valar, and the first Dark Lord was also one of them. And then there are angels of lower rank, the Maiar. Sauron is one of them. The Balrogs are one of them. Gandalf, Saruman, etc. Also, all are Maiar. And however, this powerful first Dark Lord raised the Misty Mountains, so it's probably also like somewhat of a cursed place, if you want, like a wicked place in many ways, with many you see many dark things happen there, finding the One Ring and so on. So it's an interesting, very interesting place in the world of Tolkien, and he hides there. The dwarves find the Balrog, wake him up, and then havoc starts. It should also be maybe mentioned that the dwarves always were, or let's say the Misty Mountains and the dwarves living in the Misty Mountains, the Misty Mountains were basically contested by orcs always. There's this very important place for the dwarves called Gundabad. We see it in the Hobbit films, though there it seems like a fortress or something, but it's basically it's a special mountain or mountainy place, if that makes sense, where the dwarves, one of the dwarves, Durin, original awoke. So it's a very important holy place, you could almost say, a sacred place for the dwarf, very important. And this was contested. At some point, the orcs conquered it, and so on, the dwarves conquered it back, and there was a lot of back and forth in those. And then they woke this power up, and this significantly weakened the presence of the dwarves in the Misty Mountains, because suddenly you have like a being on the power level of Sauron in your, I don't know, in your basement, if you want. And that is definitely not what you want. As a result, you also still have the orcs there, and they're basically, the clash starts, and through the Balrog, Moria, then the king gets killed and so on, or has to flee basically, and the people have to escape from there, and Moria is abandoned, and suddenly they lost their main kingdom of the dwarves. It was like a devastating blow to them, and I think that is basically the early chronology how this came to be. And then when there was silence in the halls of Moria, and the Balrog probably could rest there again and had his could wait for the potential return of his master. Also a complicated topic.
I think the taking a quick high level before going back into the detail, I think it's worth noting, as you talked about this, the layers of sort of the powerful beings. Sauron and the Balrog, this Durin's Bane, as this Balrog became known, are sort of on that side. Both Maiar, they're both sort of on the same-ish level, incredibly powerful beings. We also get Smaug, who's not the same, but obviously also incredibly powerful. And Sauron seems to have had this same kind of strange relationship with the Balrog and Smaug, and also to an extent with Shelob, which is that whereas these might be expected to sort of follow Morgoth, the first big baddie's lead, they couldn't be expected to follow Sauron, but they probably could be expected to kind of fall in line with his aims and objectives. And so he was very keen for Smaug, for example, to be free, to be able to roam the land and destroy things and cause a whole load of havoc, because that would help him. And the Balrog as well, he seemed very happy for the Balrog to be there, and he sort of like encouraged the orcs to be going back in and repopulating that. And the Balrog seemed okay with the orcs being there. And as you say, he was just living there, slumbering, and just sort of awaiting the right time. When Balin comes back, the people, the resistance is from the orcs rather than from the Balrog, because it's not huge. They are just a drop in the ocean of the huge scale of Moria. He's not really affected by them. They're claiming a few of these little halls. They're quite big halls, but the orcs could deal with it. He didn't have to bother himself with it. This is not a huge issue for the Balrog. So that's my take. And it's really only when we get Gandalf coming in, who is also a Maya, also at this kind of level, that's the time when the Balrog really has to start taking the front foot here and actually dealing with the incursion into Moria. So it's a sort of a who's on his level. He doesn't actually need to bother that much about a small contingent of dwarves. He does have to be bothered about Gandalf.
Yeah.
Which brings us to David Oliver question saying, what was bigger, Moria or Menegroth? Menegroth was the Thousand Caves, but this is way back in the First Age.
Yeah.
So this was built, the elves lived there, but this was partly built by the dwarves. Now, my take, I don't know whether there's a sort of a size chart or something you've ever come across, Chris. My take is that whereas Menegroth had 1,000 caves and was an astonishingly beautiful place by all accounts, Moria was massive. This is like taking up the underneath of a mountain range, many, many levels, city areas, mines. It was just huge. Does that kind of chime with your understanding of the difference?
Yeah, I would. Robert, I would definitely agree with your what you said, and it's interesting. I think because we are in the First Age, of course, it's late. No, it's not late. Well, it depends on when. Well, it's early First Age when it was founded. Well, it's not. Let's not go into the chronological stuff there, but it's always complicated with the years, with the Valiant years and so on. Let's not dive into that, but. If you think about the population of the elves at that time, Tolkien did some calculations for the first few generations, and I think it was around 100,000 elves or so at the I don't know exactly 8th, 9th generation or something like this, or maybe even further down the line. I forgot the exact numbers. You can find it in Nature of Middle-earth. There's a little breakdown of it, and I assume that the dwarves who woke up very shortly after the elves with much shorter lifespan than the elves, potentially, even though we know that the dwarves had not that many children and the population increased slowly, I would assume they could have the potential to be more in numbers than the elves, but it's just pure speculation here by my side. As a result, I would assume that Moria, as you said, was pretty massive, and it was not only a place to dwell in, while Menegroth was basically the palace of the king of King Thingol back in the day, and Moria was also a place where they worked, where they had mines and so on. Very important place also for the dwarves and so on. So I would also agree with you there.
Excellent. Aidan O'Hara just saying sup. Thank you very much for that. And a question from Lyle Hammock. I'll throw this one to you first, I think, Chris. Could you expand on the people of Rovianen? They played key roles in the Kinstrife and war against the Wain Riders. Also, what third age story would you like to see as a TV series? Well, feel free to tack that onto your answer. So, although Vianen is an area, if you think of your map of Middle Earth, it's the area around Mirkwood itself, across to the Misty Mountains, of the little area sort of to the south of that as well. So I think it goes as far as Erebor. So it's that broad area that wasn't covered by Gondor down the south or Arnor up in the sort of the northwest. And the peoples there did have quite a lot of we hear about them sort of in relation to Gondor, I think, a lot when it comes to the appendices to the Lord of the Rings. I think they come up quite a lot. This is where part of the kin strife came from. I said it was a succession war within Gondor, where the probably rightful heir married somebody from up there, and some people go, oh no, don't really like that. What's your take on is there an overarching story, do you think, there, or is this just a sort of a bitty collection of sort of different things?
Yes, definitely. Rovanion is definitely a thing that's really a collection. We have to piece it together a little bit. There are definitely some interesting side notes about this area, and it's really interesting. A lot of the Norsemen were there originally when the first group of men that went into these regions of Middle Earth, called the Edain. On the way, some settled down somewhere, and one group settled down in this area basically, and they became later known as, let's call them, the Norsemen. And they play definitely a bit of a role, because the kin, as you said, we talked about the kin strife, is of course related to this, because one of the Gondorian princes married, or kings married a noble of the Norsemen and not a Dunedain. And we also have the difference in lifespans, and people feared, they don't have the same lifespans as the Dunedain of, I don't know, 120 to sometimes up to almost, I don't know, 400 something years. That could diminish the line and the lifespan and the life expectations of future kings and so on. There was basically a lot of fire into this whole kin strife. There was a lot of drama about it, let's put it that way. And as a result, the Rain Riders came, as we said. The Gondor was also attacked after the kin strife, or around the kin strife, also attacked by Easterlings called the Rain Riders, and they, of course, also attacked Rovanion, the Norsemen, and they also had to fight and so on. They allied with Gondor, and this also strengthened, I assume, beyond this marriage between the king and the noblewoman, also the friendship, the allegiance between the Norsemen, at least some groups of the Norsemen, the Eotheod, and of course Gondor. And as a result, they much later, there are definitely other stories that led to this, but from the films we also know these fires that start, and they have this communication system to call for Rohan, or Rohan for Gondor, and so on, because the people of Rohan are later related to those people, to those Norsemen. And yeah, it's a very interesting topic. But as you said, it's small little stories, mentions here and there, and you have to piece them together a bit. But I think the question also asked after if it would be interesting to see it in a TV series. And yeah, definitely. I think that's very interesting. I think we get not exactly about this, but there's War of the Rohirim, like an anime film that is made at some point, that's at least, let's say, loosely tied to this, about Hammerhand. And it's quite interesting, I have to admit. So yeah, it's an interesting topic.
I mean, I don't think I'd pick up anything extra there from your main answer in terms of the TV series. We're in, for those who haven't picked up on this, we're in a weird situation in terms of rights to the world of Tolkien,
Yes.
that we don't know all of the details. but it appears that that Amazon have the right to make TV shows, and the original rights holders who I forget who it is, maybe Time Warner, have the right to make films, movies. We don't know whether they can each go across the entire span of Tolkien's history. We don't know many details more about this, but what we do know is that we've got the War of the Rohirrim, which you mentioned there, is an anime film which is going to be coming out. They're making it, so presumably it's going to come out at some point next year, and this could be the first of many. And also, incidentally, what we're still calling the Lord of the Rings TV show, even though it's not going to be about the main Lord of the Rings story, it's going to be set at some point. They'll tell us the real name. This could also be the first of many TV shows that Amazon are going to be running, and so we could end up with almost two different creations, because all of the Amazon things will clearly tie in with each other, and presumably the different things that the film rights holders have will tie together. But will those two different things tie together? We simply don't know. It's a really interesting and quite murky world right now, but I think the good news is that we're going to get a lot of content over the course of the next probably decade. There's going to be a lot of Tolkien content coming out. So that's definitely something to be looking forward to.
That's really kind of interesting, because if you look at Tolkien's world, it's also a lot about, I don't know, we have, of course, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, so we have completed stories. And then it starts getting like problematic to when it comes to like a canon or whatever. And Tolkien always originally started with, he wanted to create a mythology for England. If you look at mythology, at classic mythology and sources for it, you often also notice that it's like having different versions of the same text. That also happens in mythology quite a lot. And it's hard to form like a classic canon that we know maybe from other, let's say franchises. And in a way, this idea of mythology is reflected by, let's say, we have like a film that might not fit into the series and into maybe some video games, and it's basically like all different stories that maybe don't fit together, like an oral tradition of giving your mythology to the next generation, and it maybe changes over time a bit, and maybe this place knows it this way and the other, kind of reflecting maybe what Tolkien wants to do, even though it happens by accident. Not sure if you would agree on that, Robert.
Yeah, I think so. And the approach of the Tolkien estate has always been that if Tolkien wrote about it, if it's there in the pages of the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion or something, then it happens and you can't change it. But the bits in between, Tom Shippey, who's a great Tolkien scholar who was hired initially to help out with the TV series, he was very clear that the bits in between, like, for example, what we were speculating on, what the Nazgul may have been up to for a couple of thousand years, that is fair game. As long as it doesn't go against anything, as it doesn't contradict anything, then you can use that in your licensed bit of fiction. Talking of which, there was a super chat a moment ago that I missed, actually, but I've just come back to. Schmaklaus saying, have you heard of the games Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War? Now, I know you have, Chris, and I'm going to throw this one over to you because I know that you have, as well as being a huge Tolkien expert, you've got a second channel which is about video games. So could you perhaps just tell us, how do they fit into for those who don't know these video games? I've not played them myself. I'm aware of them, but I've played very quickly. So, but I've not played through them in any way. Where do they fit into all of this? What are they about?
Yeah, they are, I would say, a bit all over the place when it comes to the lore. There's a lot of, let's say, correct lore in it, but there's also a lot of things that contradict the timeline, like, completely, and don't really work. It feels a bit like a fan fiction in a way, or like a huge what if scenario. And the idea is basically of those games. The foundation of it is about the elf who made the rings of power, except for the One Ring, of course. It's not 100% clear if he really made all the rings, but that's a different. Let's just pretend he made the rings of power, and called Celebrimbor, and he, of course, dies at some point, is slain by Sauron, and the game's idea is basically, what if his spirit would still be in Middle Earth and possess a certain human being, and they basically become like this powerful Dunedain that is heavily inspired by Aragorn, I guess, in many ways. And he suddenly also has, as a second part of him or his soul, is this Celebrimbor, and it gives him, let's say, superpowers. That's basically how you can imagine it. And I call it always, what he has is next level immortality. And because if he dies, he suddenly reappears, and so the game explains how he can respawn and so on. And when he dies, the game moves on a little bit, and it has a very interesting system that it basically use, I don't know how you want to call it, little narrative set pieces for orcs, basically, and you can recruit them. So because he has also some ties to the One Ring, and he's able then to dominate orcs and basically build a little army. And it's called Shadow of Mordor because it plays in Mordor, and there's some stuff in it that will probably go too far to go through all the problems there. But the original idea is also, we talked about it. I also mentioned it like I don't know, 20 minutes ago, something that Gondor guarded the Black Gate, and this is also in the game, and that is that Gondor at one point had guards at the Dunedain Rangers at the Black Gate is true, but not at the time when this game plays, because it plays between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and so, and as a result, the King's Drive is like, I don't know, let's say 2,500 years earlier, and after that the Black Gate isn't guarded by Gondor anymore. So the timeline is totally butchered. Even the idea that Celebrimbor possesses a man and gives him connects with him in like a weird, let's put it, a curse or whatever you want to call it, in a weird ritual. And as a result, he becomes next level immortal, and I don't know, undoes or reduces or removes the gift of men. It also complicates the mortality of a human or of men. That is, I don't know. It's it's philosophically difficult to really discuss this, but it's a fun game.
I mean, as I say, I've dabbled rather than played through it, but it does come across as a really fun game to play. I mean, I don't particularly like what I understand they've done with the sort of the character of Celebrimbor after his death, but that's I think a different discussion. I would, just as a complete digression, but as we're on the subject, there is another Lord of the Rings video game coming out soon, isn't it? About Gollum. Do you know about this?
Yes, I have seen some of the trailers. It's interestingly made by a German publisher / developer that is known for point-and-click adventures. I would even say it's somewhat internationally, but especially in Germany, and of really good quality, I have to admit. But now they basically want to make like a stealth game in 3D and not like this beautiful drawn stuff that they did before. That seems unusual, and like it's a big step for us. Like German game developers and publishers are usually quite small for various amount of reasons. It's a topic for itself, but it's a big step for them. So I expect it to be a bit wonky, but maybe in its core it could be good, because the idea of you basically play Gollum. I'm not 100% sure when the game will take place. I obviously before Lord of the Rings, I heavily assume. And you see in one of the trailers, you see a Mordor, and so Gollum was in Mordor, I don't know, Third Age, 3000 something, so late Third Age, I think. I forgot when he was when he left Mordor. I think 3017 or something like this. Not sure when he was captured. Times sometimes hard to remember, but it plays there, and a stealth action game with Gollum. I don't know. Gollum is, I think, one of the most iconic characters, so I really look forward to them. Very curious how it will be, but my expectations are also tune them down a little bit, to be honest, because it's just like the first time this studio makes a game that is not like a point and click adventure, or at least similar to that, and like a completely different genre they have not done before with a stealth action game, I assume. But potentially the idea I find intriguing, to be honest.
Yeah, I've seen the trailers for it, and it looks good. You can always, with the trailers for video games, they're always obviously just showing you the really good bits and often not actual gameplay. But it looked really good, and I will happily, when it comes out, I will happily pass on reviews from hardcore gamers, and perhaps you could sort of let me know how it goes. Anyway, let's go back to a couple of questions. Had Reflective Rambling picking up. Thank you, Reflective Rambling. I love it when people do this, pick up questions for other people in the chat. The chat goes through very quickly, and when people do super chats, I can spot them easily. So thank you so much, Reflective Rambling, picking up for Javier, or perhaps Xavier, who then followed up by saying, "Hey, don't try and pronounce my last name." So I won't. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Saying, what do you guys think made Gondor different from Arnor? Why did Gondor succeed and Arnor fail? This is a really interesting question. I mean, I think I'll give my starting thought on this one, and then Chris, perhaps you could add a couple of thoughts. As we said, there was an overarching plan that it would appear through the Third Age, led by probably the Witch King on behalf of Sauron, to be taking down these two kingdoms. And the Witch King seems to have focused his attention most on Arnor. So why did Arnor fail? I think the first answer is because the Witch King was focused on Arnor first, really, rather than Gondor. He was wanting to take down both, but he focused in on Arnor. And it's worth also saying that Arnor was not as densely populated as Gondor. It was never this hugely populous region particularly after the plague happened. Gondor, yes, was devastated by it, but when it came up to Arnor, there was hardly anyone left. This, incidentally, is why you get this situation at the time of the Lord of the Rings. You get the Rangers, and you think, well, where's this civilization gone? We're told that there was this great kingdom. In fact, 3 kingdoms here in Arnor. Where are they all? They were all largely destroyed because they started on lower numbers. So I mean, those are my sort of very practical starting points for perhaps why Arnor failed in a way that Gondor managed to limp on for much longer. Chris, do you have any extra thoughts about the structures of them or anything else like that maybe helped Gondor survive and Arnor not?
It's a very fascinating question, thinking about it. I think one big difference between Gondor and Arnor is definitely that, maybe I'm completely wrong, but from my memory, up until the point when the war against Angmar started, Arnor was a relatively peaceful place. They never had to really bother about their borders that much. They had the Misty Mountains protecting them from one side. Of course, there were some hillmen, maybe some architects here and there, maybe some trolls came down the mountains, you name it. But they also had Rivendell nearby, and also Lindon, even though the power of the elves was declining already at the time of Arnor. But I think not many threats could come up their way. While Gondor always had a border to Harad and to the Easterlings and had constantly fights with it, and also Mordor was basically next door and was also kind of an unpleasant place where they also guarded for some time, so evil would not return there. So they had to also spend some of their power to basically keep the threat of Mordor coming back to power as low as possible. And they had a lot of experience, I think, in these war scenarios compared to Arnor, which was mostly, I would assume, a very relatively peaceful place. Only when like a big force came from outside in the form of the witch of the Witch King, that becoming the Witch King of Angmar, then they started to struggle. And there was also another thing that Gondor did better than Arnor. Gondor was not split, so there was this huge dissension between three heirs of one king of Arnor, which was one kingdom when it was founded by Elendil, and also Elendil was the High King. So technically, Elendil was also the ruler of Gondor, but he basically let his sons rule there as kings, and he was the High King of all the Dunedain in exile. And yeah, it definitely had it had prestige, if you want, in that regard. And after the war, after the War of the Last Alliance and so on, this might have changed a little bit. And then one of the ancestors of Isildur there had the trouble that his three sons could not agree on who would become king. It was clearly ruled that the oldest son would become his heir. And then as a result, through this dissension, the Arnor was splitted in three kingdoms that are called Arthedain, Cardolan, and Hrudauer. And this was the first place. There was dissension, it was split, and it maybe also reflects some other kingdoms other great realms we know from our history. When they start splitting, suddenly things go down the hill, and one then got in contact with the Witch King, and he managed to bring the line in Hrudauer to fail, basically. And as a result, from there, it started going downhill.
I think those are excellent points. I don't think I could add anything to that. I think the splitting it into three, the divide and conquer, always seems to work in history, and an incredibly valid point about Gondor. It was part of their psychology to be looking out for danger, to be on guard. That was what Gondor was about. Fantastic points. Question in the chat from Skywalker Samadhi saying, why didn't the Balrog sense Gandalf on his first trip through Moria? Did Pippin inadvertently save Middle-earth by being a fool and dropping a stone? Which I love. That second part, I'm already writing a video in my head about that. Did Pippin inadvertently save Middle-earth? On possibly a couple of different occasions with Pippin.
Well, a pretty good title.
Exactly. Yeah, that's clickbait if you ever saw it. How Pippin saved Middle-earth. But just on this first thing with Balrog sensing Gandalf, I don't know whether you have a particular take on this yourself, Chris. I think Gandalf, when he was sort of heading through the first time, he wasn't he wasn't causing a fuss. He was just going through to get from one side to the other. So it's not like you've got this bunch of heavily armed people going through, dropping stones down wells and things like that. So it was a very different feel. But did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I not really. I think I assume. I mean, fate is always like a topic in Tolkien's world, and I think it was not the right time for Gandalf and the Balrog to meet. And also, there was no. Yes, it's hard to say. I think with the situation when Gandalf confronted the Balrog was also when his fellowship was around. He had to protect them from the Balrog. They knew they had no chance against this ancient demonic power from a long forgotten past for maybe, I don't know. And that is just something he had to step in. And maybe in the other scenario, even if they had met, maybe Gandalf could have just phased out and said, I'm out of here. Maybe no need to fight or confront him yet. Maybe come up with a plan or something how to approach this Balrog. I mean, the Balrog was in Gandalf the Grey's active time around for a long time. You probably have heard about Durin's Bane before, for sure he had, and he never thought, yeah, let's go to let's face him there. It's definitely probably a thing he somewhat, I wouldn't say, he did not want to avoid it, because I think it's Gandalf's idea to go through Moria, which is different in the movies, but in the books I think he wants to go through Moria. And yeah, I don't know, maybe he at that point, definitely his path in fate and the fate of the Balrog started clashing there, but I don't have a better answer for this.
No, and I think that's fair. I think it's the first time he was sneaking through, and it's fair to say he wasn't necessarily expecting to meet a Balrog.
Yeah, true.
That's when he's there, and it's just like, I felt a power beyond anything. It was just like it's a Balrog. It was this what the first, definitely his first go through. It wasn't like he was sort of he thought he found a Balrog and then ran away. It was he just snuck through.
Definitely.
Question from David Oliver saying, am I right in thinking Ungoliant lives in Valinor in the Pelori? Well, so Ungoliant, for those, again, thinking back to previous live streams, this is sort of like early on. Ungoliant is this great mother of Shelob, but this great sort of spider-like creature that Tolkien comes up with wonderful ways to sort of describe Ungoliant as is an incredibly horrible creature who sort of emits unlight. It's not darkness, it's just like it's anti-light, and sucks the life from the trees of Valinor. And where Ungoliant did live, so this is in the past tense beforehand, where Morgoth found Ungoliant was indeed just the Peloria, the mountains around Valinor, just sort of hiding down there in a chasm underneath there. So it was, where do you least expect to find Ungoliant? Actually, in the Undying Lands. It was a very clever little hiding place there.
Avatar, or what it was called.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew K just confirming, yes, it is Warner Media via New Line Cinema, which is a subsidiary of theirs who own the rights. Scott Walker, thank you very much for the super sticker. Reflective Rambling saying, seeing that you missed a super chat about technology in the chat.
Yeah, there was.
Was there one about that?
One in the questions read about the Witch King, I think, or something.
Oh, right. There was a second.
The Nazgul not appearing. There was like a second part of it.
Yes. So this was one of the questions from my patrons, asking. This was from James Horner. This was the second part. Was do you have a theory on why technology advanced so slowly in Middle Earth?
Tough topic.
Which is so it's a huge topic, and this is an issue for a lot of fantasy worlds, it has to be said, because a lot of it, certainly this is a question that comes up a lot when talking about the world of Ice and Fire. Just slight digression for a moment into The Witcher. One thing which is quite interesting in the Witcher world is that is deliberately set in a world which has the feel of being on the verge of something that, if not an industrial revolution, then perhaps a renaissance or something along those lines, where you have magic but also technology. Just every now and then you just get this new thing that somebody's invented, or a sort of a machine that seems like the next step along. It's an interesting setting that sort of takes the classical fantasy setting but then tries to sort of push it up to say, where are we monsters with like metal plates with the sort of serial number stamped on them, that kind of thing. It's just kind of feel like they're almost on the edge, but obviously that's not what's happening here with Tolkien. And technology here, it's fair to say, as is the case with a lot of fantasy, technology appears to have been greater in the past when we had Numenor. Numenor seems to have been the height of technology and sort of the merging of technology and magic in a way. And so what we're seeing in the current world, or the world when we experience through The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, is a world that has fallen in technology since then. But why do you think, Chris, why do you think that, although we have got that kind of arc, why do you think that technology hasn't, over the course of, say, the Third Age, it hasn't progressed? Do you think there are reasons for that?
Yeah, I think it's really a complicated topic, and has also to do with some decisions of Tolkien, I think. For example, if we just go back to Numenor, of course, as the realm of men, the most advanced ever, basically like Atlantis, you could compare it to that. And originally Tolkien wanted to make Numenor pretty advanced, and originally he had some ideas of, for example, metal ships that go without sails. There are some hints that could be interpreted as guns and so on. There are even some hints at airships. So it would be kind of interesting if Tolkien would be also known as, like, I know, the originator of steampunk or something. But it's kind of fascinating that Tolkien had exactly these ideas, but that maybe that's still a bit too much. And as a result, he toned it down a bit. And then after the downfall, after this basically huge civilization, and they had, of course, writing systems of the elves. They wrote scrolls and books we can read, and started to having knowledge, and they were in contact with the elves. We can even read that the elves taught them some crafts and so on. And then they were on this isolated island, had no enemies, and could just, I know, in Age of Empires terms, they could just boom there. And just advancing in technology really fast, and having even friends who are also advanced, the elves from not Middle Earth, but from Aman, where also these high angels and angels of low rank live. They even could have had some access to their knowledge, and as a result, that is why they could explode so much. And when their civilization basically disappeared by the, you could say, intervention of God himself, then suddenly there was like a vacuum of knowledge in the world. Suddenly, the people who know everything are gone. What are you going to do then? And in the meantime, men, for example, in Middle Earth did not progress as far. Only a few of them survived, and then could bring some of the knowledge back to Middle Earth, and they founded Gondor and Arnor, which were also very advanced. But I think it's definitely knowledge was for sure lost when this happened, and so they fell back a bit. And it's though always, I mean, Tolkien, you have to combine a bit, like, this is more like a historical view on it, but you also have to keep in mind that we're still talking about mythology that Tolkien wanted to create. If we go back to the First Age, for example, the sword Narsil, and later forged into Aragorn's sword Anduril, it is a dwarven sword, interestingly, and the men, or the dwarf who made this sword, also made, for example, other artifacts like the helm of Dorlomin, which was like a helmet that could protect, like, it had the magical ability to protect you from, I don't know, I think it was like arrows or something, that you couldn't get hurt that much. It had like a magical protection. If you have a concept like this, it contradicts somewhat technology, if you want, or we have to go into the sci-fi genre to basically explain it technology-wise. And then you also have, I don't know, you want to go into the machine direction and industrialization, maybe, then you suddenly move over to this more historic context, and those, of course, clash. As a result, I would say that is a reason why technology sometimes seem to not advance as fast. But on top of that, I think one of your mods pointed it out, there was no press for making books and so on, and everything on Middle Earth was just on a much lower level. If we think about how long it took us if we think about, I don't know, Europe 4,000 years ago and to now, there's a huge difference. Even if we go just 1,000 years back into Europe and compare it to now, like a lot of knowledge just has accumulated over the last, let's say, 100, 200 years. Like there was just such a vast progression that we have seen there. And before, it was relatively slow for different reasons, because it was always unstable. And in Middle Earth, we also had Sauron, of course, and who pressured, and it was like this constant fear at the horizon, coming and destroying everything. So you had definitely like a different focus than just booming your technology and your knowledge. And it's just still a few thousand years, which sounds like a lot from our today's perspective. But I think if we just go back 10,000 years ago, when we hunted, I know, mammoths or something, then a few thousand years later, I don't know, there was for sure some advancement in technology, and then something terrible happened, and the technology on the knowledge was reduced, and it was like an up and down a little bit. I think that is also another reason that why fantasy often has problems in like to really advance in a couple of thousand years to a meaningful way of technology. Interestingly, in some early versions of First Age text, we also find like hints of machinery of the first Dark Lord Morgoth, when related to the fall of Gondolin. Quite interesting, but it's a bit inconsistent sometimes.
It is, and I mean, I think we have to play into this the fact that Tolkien, whilst not being a Luddite, he was not really a fan of technology and the Industrial Revolution and all the rest of it. I think his heart was very much in the simple technologies rather than the huge amounts of technological development, and so we often see that kind of leak out into the story, where the technological development that's good is often connected with elves and magic and things like that. But if you ever get into sort of anything that hints of being a factory or something like that, that is often connected with bad and darkness and cutting down trees. So there is definitely a personal thing there happening with Tolkien, but also in a more sort of literary style. He wanted Numenor to appear as this kind of Atlantis. He sometimes even called it Numenor Atlantis. And that means for that to work literarily, you need to be able to look at this sort of great lost kingdom and think how amazing it was. If the technology had improved vastly since then it kind of loses its luster. So that's the kind of feel. The feel that we've got here is this kind of European Dark Ages post the fall of the Roman Empire, where we've lost a lot of the technology. That's the feel of where it is. So there's a lot of this feel that has permeated out into wider fantasy fiction.
Wasn't it that also, I don't know, the Romans already had concrete, and then it was lost and only rediscovered much later, something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was. There's I can remember some Roman constructs in England, and some architect was talking about them and about how they had concrete there, and the walls were thick, that actually they could tell that in the middle, through some magical science means, they could tell that the concrete in the middle still hadn't fully set. And it was fully set on the outside, but not on the inside. The Romans had just got this astonishing abilities, and they also had vending. Did you know? Digression. They had vending machines. The Romans. They had invented a machine that you could put a coin in, and it poured some nice fresh water out for you. Astonishing.
Awesome. Didn't know that.
What the Romans did for us. Okay, I think I had.
One thing, maybe I can add. A medic from chat also said, like, I think Tolkien wanted to warn on overuse of technology. I think that's a very good way to phrase it. He wasn't against technology per definition, but he was against the overuse of it, and what we talked about it a moment ago, that the concept, this philosophical concept of the machine, the shortcut to power, and this was why he called it like this, because if you overuse it, and you can use the machine to also as a shortcut to power, to increase, and of course knowing World War I and so on, he has seen what machines are able to do if you overuse them.
Yeah, absolutely. He was definitely scarred by his experiences in World War One. Node of the Rings is in the chat. Hi there, Matt. Great to see you. So excited to hear us talk about the Tolkien. You caught us talking about technology, World War One, and the Roman Empire. So perhaps the wrong time, but great to see you there. For those who don't know, Node of the Rings has got an excellent channel. I highly recommend you go and check that out. I'm sure one of the moderators will drop a link into the chat, which leads into me doing a thank you I do every single time to my moderators. You are the best in the business. If there's a business of being a moderator, I'm not sure, but you're amazing people. If you are watching this live, if you're in the chat, please do show a little bit of love to the moderators. They do a fantastic job. Another thank you just from me while I'm doing my thank yous. Patrons, thank you. I cannot do what I do without your support. That's why I do things like prioritizing patrons' questions for these live streams and also provide some patron exclusive content. If you want to hear me reading the pre-release chapters from the Winds of Winter, if you're on a Song of Ice and Fire fan, you will find them over on Patreon as well. Patreon is the best way to support this channel if you so wish. There is a link down in the description. And with that, let's go to one of my patrons' questions. This is Matthew Hawkins. And this is, I'm going to throw this one straight to Chris because I don't know the answer to this one. Do we have any idea of the size of the elven population of the Grey Havens and Lindon? Did they constitute a powerful elven army during the War of the Ring? Well, in terms of the second part of that, I can answer that very quickly. No, there was not a powerful elven force in the War of the Rings, certainly not down in the southeast. There were battles happening, Thranduil and Lothlorien, they fought lots of battles, which happened off-page in the War of the Ring. Elrond says, in an offhand comment during the Council of Elrond, we don't really have the forces here, or even over with Círdan to be stopping Sauron if he gets this far. But what's your take, Chris? How many elves were left? Basically, I think is the question at this point, at the end of the Third Age. How sizable was the elven population? Do you think?
I tried to look for some information on this, if there is any, shortly before the stream started. So my research was not that deep, but I found sadly not really good numbers. I could have imagined that there was a new book released this year in September called The Nature of Middle Earth, and it has some chapters with numbers in it, like population, for example, of Numenor. I think at the downfall of Numenor, 50 million people lived there, which is quite impressive.
It's quite big, yeah.
And Numenor had around the size of Spain, if my math was right. So it's also interesting, but sadly, I did not find very good numbers for the elven population. Only when the first few generations, Tolkien did some math for the great journey. So when the elves awoke at a bay of a sea called Sea of Helkar, and the bay was called Cuivienen, and from there they got pressured by the first Dark Lord and had to leave. And over their leave and going to the coast of Middle Earth, many generations this time this took, and he calculated how the population grew. With, I think there are also different versions of this, because time is a very complicated topic in this, how long like a year is, because sun and moon were not there and so on, if you not count the round world version, but let's not dive into that. And yeah, I think the number I found for the latest number, or biggest number I found there in this very, very early process, and we talk very early First Age, was like, I think 136,000 elves. So that's not that much, I guess. So it's not like millions of elves. And this was the whole elven population of that time. Of course, now we're talking about the Third Age, which is like, I don't know, let's say 10,000 years later or something. from that point. Okay, maybe even more depending on what time calculation you do, but the population of elf could be a lot bigger, but as elves live very, very long and have only very certain life cycles where they have children, and then usually very few, like 1 or 2 is, I think, very common for elf. Fëanor with 7 was like really an exception almost. I would assume they did not grow that much, like maybe a little bit. And then, of course, we have to think that the elves left Middle-earth. So it seems like after the war of Angmar, there was the mention of like a little army from Rivendell, and in some versions led by Glorfindel, in others by Elrond. Interesting detail. And also Lindon under Círdan, forming armies and then fight with the Gondorian army against the remaining forces of Angmar. And after that, I think not many army action of the elves of Lindon and Rivendell are really mentioned again. They probably had like small forces here and there, but nothing really big. And I assume it reduced further and further down the Third Age to a point where the elves said, now it is not we don't have the strength, the forces anymore. It's also not our time anymore to fight in this war. The War of the Ring is a war of the other 3 peoples of Middle-earth. And we can only guide them with advice, maybe give them awesome gifts like Galadriel did. But we can't provide too many forces anymore. Though there was, of course, Thranduil still as a realm. Like the elves in this region, east of the Misty Mountains, like the Sylvan elves, it always feels like they were not that strong when it comes to leaving Middle-earth yet. The feeling of leaving Middle-earth was not that strong in them anymore. And not yet, I should phrase it like this. And as a result, they might have some force, and they've also fought in this war, but as Robert mentioned. But like when it comes to Lindon and Rivendell and so on, they probably had not the forces anymore. They were also not needed because Angmar was gone, and the war mainly happens, let's say, on the other side of the Misty Mountains.
Yeah, I don't think I've got much to add to that. The overall impression we get is that there are 4, off the top of my head, Elven Enclaves. We get Lothlorien, which can defend itself magically and also has some elves, but it's not a huge elven population. Thranduil in northern Mirkwood, again, we read about that population both in The Hobbit and also we hear about it in The Lord of the Rings. It feels like it's a substantial population, but not massive. We're not talking hundreds of thousands or anything like that.
Yeah,
Rivendell is not big. There's never any impression that Rivendell. I mean, yes, they've got some pretty high-powered people there, but it's not a massive army base. And then Círdan over on the far coast, again, we don't hear about him having really an army. He's a boat builder. That's what he's about.
Yeah.
So it's the impression, we're never given a number, but the impression is that the might of the elves have gone. They're good enough to defend themselves there are various attacks. I think 3 attacks on Lothlorien, a couple more in northern Mirkwood during the War of the Ring. They can defend themselves, but they would not be able to against the might of Sauron's army as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. Just to add to this a little bit, just a thought that they also, the elves, Lindon, the last high king of the elves, there of the Noldor elves, also died at the end of the War of the Last Alliance, and Elrond was his vice-regent and maybe could have claimed the title of king, but he decided against it. I assume because there weren't the need for a high king at that point. There was, after the Last Alliance, war was peace, at least to something for some time in this region at least, and it was, I think the numbers were not there. Why become king of this? And it worked out that as well. I think that the need for a high king, so but a huge organ that organizes everything, that maybe builds other realms and so on, and guards the borders and so on. It wasn't that high in the priority anymore. That I think it's also another question of the Patreon questions about asking about this. So basically, we're taking this a bit here, but yeah, I think this shows already that Elrond does not say, okay, or the elves say, we need another High King, that, yeah, we are slowly phasing out of Middle-earth. We don't need to build big kingdoms anymore. We don't need big realms. We now have to focus a bit on our departure here. And so, yeah, that indicates, as Robert said, that the numbers are not that great anymore.
Yeah, I agree completely. Just that we sort of gone into that other question about why Elrond didn't claim the kingship, which he probably could have done. Similarly, Galadriel perhaps could have tried. This is after Gil-galad has gone. And I agree with you completely. I think there's two elements to this. The first is what you've just very eloquently said. There basically aren't that many elves anymore. So the need for there to be a king is really quite limited. Secondly, I think Elrond just didn't feel the need to be king. He had humility. There was no desire. He did rule effectively in Rivendell, but that was all he was ever really wanting to do. I think that's the sort of the answer to that. David Oliver, a question in the chat saying, I got the impression that Sauron was responsible for both the Long Winter and the Fell Winter in the Shire and the northern areas. This is interesting. This was so the Long Winter, off the top of my head, was 2700 and something. This hit the Shire really badly. Lots of hobbits died. It was, as you would expect from the name, a very long and bad winter. Similarly, we get, and this is going to be the basis of the War of the Rohirrim. There was this huge winter affected Rohan and basically snowed in the remnants of the Rohirrim who were under Helm Hammerhand. They were there in the Hornburg in Helm's Deep. It was named Helm's Deep after Helm Hammerhand. And the question is was all of this caused by Sauron? And I don't think, and maybe Chris, you've got the detailed knowledge on this that I haven't, I don't think we ever get confirmation of this any more than we get confirmation that, say, the plague that we were talking about earlier came from Sauron, but it kind of makes sense. And it also, during that period, you see that Rohan and Gondor had built up this strong alliance, and this crippled Rohan and the enemies of the Dunlendings, the enemies of Rohan, seem to be using this as a chance to be getting rid of the Rohirrim. Similarly, at the same time, there'd been a fleet building down there with in Umbar who attacked Gondor. They seem to have been waiting for this. So this does it gives the kind of the impression that maybe there's some hand guiding all of this. But I mean, I don't know. Do you, Chris, know if there's any actual confirmation of that?
No, I don't think there's an actual confirmation. I think the confirmation for the Great Plague definitely being related to Sauron is the evidence for that is much, much clearer than the confirmation for the Fell Winters. I think I have not looked really into this topic, to be honest, so I can't tell you out of my head, yeah, something is written there, but just out of the top of my head, I don't think so. Well, for example, the Great Plague, there's some interesting detail. I know this because of the video I'm working on for like a very long time now, and in the background. And I even have the quotes here from me, just looked up my script. There's like, in the Appendix A, we find soon after a deadly plague came... no, let me just read it again. Soon after a deadly plague came with dark winds out of the east. So we have the phrase dark winds. And when Sauron, for example, escapes the fall of the fall of Numenor, for example, we can also read about a dark wind, and that he returns to Mordor like a dark wind, something like this. It is phrased. So you could definitely interpret this as Sauron was definitely was likely behind the plague. In the Silmarillion, we also find a similar. The plague came upon dark winds out of the east, and it smote the king and his children, and many of the people of Gondor perished. So we have a similar phrase here, and with the dark plague and. Sauron, but his spirit arose and fled back on dark wind to Middle-earth, seeking a home. So this dark wind motive, word for word, we find in both texts. As a result, I would argue that the plague is very likely has its origin with Sauron. The fell winter, I sadly can't tell you a similar detailed. I don't have a similar detailed knowledge of it. It's quite possible, though. I agree with you that you made very good points. Why this could be like it's too many accidents happening at once that it's fitting too well there, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think I'd agree is that it's never made clear, but it kind of fits. Who was it? Somebody in the chat was saying we can't blame him for everything. If in doubt, blame Bloodraven. That was Mark Sheeser saying. So yes, I agree. It's definitely Bloodraven's fault. All of the meteorological problems in Middle Earth. If in doubt, blame Sauron. Let's come up with a new one for here. Shannon Adams saying, "Love your channel, Robert. Thank you very much. You are so measured and thoughtful, never dismissive. Thank you. I strive to be. If I ever am, I apologize. I always try and welcome anyone's thoughts. So it's one of the things I think is really important in a community like this is not to dismiss anyone's views. What is your take on Celebrian staying in the Undying Lands instead of returning to her family in Middle Earth? I understand the need to heal from trauma, but choosing not to return puzzles me. I've always seen this as the hardest part of Arwen's choice. What are your thoughts? This is the daughter of Galadriel and Celeborn, the husband of Elrond, and therefore the mother of Arwen, also the twins. So she, when traveling, I think across the Misty Mountains, gets caught and attacked. And although she isn't killed initially, she has this kind of poison in her, and she sort of gives up and sort of dies, and her spirit goes back or goes off to Valinor, as happens with all of the elves. I mean, what's your take on why? And maybe we need to sort of get into the differences between where Valinor is at least in the different ages. But what's your take on why she didn't return?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Celebrian survived this. In one version, she dies, in an old version, but I think in the Lord of the Rings version, Celebrian survives the attack, and Elrond can't heal her, and she's still traumatized and from this experience, and she leaves Middle-earth to find a place of healing, which is Aman. Aman. Also, Frodo later goes to Aman to find healing there, and this is a place where I think it's Este, the Valar, that is does the healing there, and it's also the place is a very beautiful place and so on. So it's good for wounds extraordinary, if you want to phrase it like this. And she, of course, has to go there, which was for sure not easy for her and her family. But I think just returning from Aman back to Middle Earth is a very difficult thing to do in of itself, because there's some history that is tied to this. If we go again back to the First Age, we have the Noldor under Feanor. We, I think, also mentioned it at the beginning. We're covering basically all the history here. Feanor leaves Aman and goes to Middle Earth to fight against Morgoth and take his jewels back, his his 3 Silmarils, and that he created. And the Noldor follow him. He would have a good claim for being the High King of the Noldor. And the Valar, though, say to him, Fëanor and all the Noldor, please don't go. That's a terrible idea. We prophesize you tears unnumbered if you do this. And this is exactly what they get. There's also a battle, the Nirnais Arnödiad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. And in it, very terrible things happen, of course, and it's a huge loss for the elves and so on. And now, just imagine we are now back a few thousand years later, and you have to go to Aman as an elf at some point anyway, because, as said earlier, the elven nature clashes with the nature of the land of Middle-earth. Their nature is immortality, is changing little, is being bound to the world itself, and the world itself is marred, as Tolkien calls it in some text later, Arda Mard. So the concept that the world is basically infused by the power of the first Dark Lord and destroyed and changed from its original vision. And this effect of this marred, of the world being marred, is weakest in Aman. So that's why the spirit of the elves can live there better and live out their immortality better than they can in Middle-earth. In Middle-earth, if they would stay, their spirit would consume their body at some point, and they would become like a race, which is not what they want. That they have to leave. And now Celebrian does this step very late, not late in her life, because she's, I'm not sure what. It's a difficult topic when she was born. Let's not dive into that. But she is definitely. Then she has done this step already in the Third Age at a time when the elves leave Middle-earth anyway, and then just returning after her being healed, basically, if she can find healing there, to Middle-earth is just, I guess, another step of going against, I assume, the recommendation of the high powers, of the high angels, of the Valar in the world, and also going a bit against her nature again, on top of having this traumatized experience. She had enough of Middle-earth when she was in this terrible situation, being captured by orcs. And if we read Lord of the Rings, we also see how terrible it must be to be captured by orcs. Like we have Merry and Pippin, for example. And they are, let's say, very high valuable victims for them, and the orcs are ordered to not harm them, and still it's pretty harsh for them there. And you can imagine that was not the case for Celebrian, even though she would probably also be considered a high value target. And she's wounded, I assume, maybe a poison wound or something. We know that orcs use poisoned weapons. And she's not treated, I assume, and this torments her greatly, and then she's rescued later. And then after this, this devastating situation she had to live through, she just had enough of this place, of this terrible world, and would just leave and hope that her husband and her children would also come to Aman at some point so they could reunite, which makes the decision of Arwen just so tragic, that she does not return to Aman and decides for a different path as half-elven.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, so because Arwen chooses the mortal life, that means that she's then not doing what her mother must have assumed would happen, is coming with Elrond back to meet her in Aman, in the Undying Lands. There is at this point just a sort of a high level take on what's going on in this world. Tolkien's world shifts and changes geographically hugely between ages, and one of the big changes is the fact that Aman, the Undying Lands, Valinor, call it what you will, this is taken out of the physical realms of Arda, and then the world is made a a world round as a globe, and so it isn't easy. You can't just get into a boat and sail to it. That's what the elves do, but they're following what's called the straight path, not going around on the curve of the globe. They're effectively going on a magical route. And one of the sort of the intricacies of this that Tolkien teased out in a number of different ways, but didn't give us a full written explanation, bullet point explanation, is the fact that corporeal bodies, human bodies, therefore, could not go any more from Aman, from Valinor to Middle Earth. Now, he sort of addresses this, as I say, he doesn't give us a full bullet points of exactly how this works, but he says, so the Istari, they're spiritual beings, and then they took on physical bodies. So when they came across, it was there with Glorfindel arriving. He sort of speculates in this wonderful way, as if he's wondering about how this world operates himself, and he sort of talks about, well, he must have come in the second age because he couldn't have come in the third age because of this change in how things operate. So Glorfindel must have arrived in the second age, he said. So it may be that even if we get Celebrian wanted to come back, she couldn't. But I think that she wouldn't want to. It's the short answer. She was fully expecting her family to be joining her there very soon, and as you say, it adds this extra layer of tragedy that Arwen would never see her mother again, like the rest of her family. Question from Lal Hammock over from Patreon saying, what information do we have about the Druiden, aka the Wildmen, the Wozes, who assisted Rohan to get to Minas Tirith? I find them interesting. So what do you want to just give us your you don't have to give us a detailed history, but just introduce us to these characters who sort of the wild men of the woods. They've got lots of names, but they've got quite a good history as well. Do you want to just sort of give us a high level go through of that?
Okay, it's a complicated topic. I try to go a bit through it. So we mentioned also earlier, again, it's so fascinating. Tolkien, like, well, everything is somehow connected, and so it's why you can always reference an answer you already gave. And we talked about the Edain, the first group of men that escaped from the Far East and became basically the foundation of the Norsemen, of the Dunedain, of the Dunelendings, of the Bree-Lendings, and so on. And also among this group of Edain, there's also the Druedain, they are, as the name suggests, and they also counted towards those. And they also are counted towards men, and all men are, of course, not all men, but all men, not all men, but these Edain group went, as said, from the east to Beleriand. That was the old west coast of Middle Earth in the First Age. And on the path, maybe some of the Druedain went and settled somewhere around the White Mountains. That is, for example, where the Hornburg is, where also, if you go further down east, Minas Tirith is. There's this huge mountain range called the White Mountains. And maybe some settled there, but not all of them. Another group of them just went further, as far as Beleriand, and lived in the First Age in Beleriand. There are, at least in some versions, hints for that. When the First Age ended with the War of Wrath and Beleriand was sunk into the ocean and destroyed, some of the Druedain, we find also hints for that in the Unfinished Tales, even went to Numenor and lived there for a time, but then later escaped again and then maybe settled somewhere, who knows where, in Middle Earth. And these Druedain are very unusual in many ways. They are much smaller than men usually are. Maybe, I guess, could compare it a bit to hobbits. They have, I think, black eyes, and when they get angry, they glow red. So they feel like very like if you compare that to how you imagine a classical human being, very unusual, and they have like tribes and they live in the forest, and also there are some interesting stories of this in the unfinished as a whole chapter, I think, called the Druidine in it, if I remember correctly. There we find some stories. I sadly I can't give all the details anymore because I don't remember them. But for example, I remember there was, maybe you remember it. There was like a mention of like they hate the orcs. That's definitely they're foes, and the orcs don't like them. They have, it seems like they have some kind of magic. They can like sit down or something and then don't move for a very long time. It feels like they are like a statue or something.
Yeah.
There was also another story with something. I can't piece that together anymore. It was really fascinating. Sadly, maybe you remember it. It always felt a bit like magical, like protecting a certain place, something like this.
Yeah, I mean, they had a lot of powers that are that they had whistling powers.
Whistling powers too.
The sitting down. They could sit down and sort of go into what seems like a sort of a meditative trance and hardly breathe at all, and look like they're statues. So they're incredible. They are definitely, they come from the sort of the race of men, humans, but they seem to have, in the same way the hobbits did, they kind of like branched out, and they
interesting branch.
Yes, they just sort of stayed by themselves. I think one of the interesting things that I sort of pick up on is some of them come across to Numenor. And so some of them become Numenorians, but they all left by about if you look at the history of Numenor, it sort of like goes up and then down, and you kind of reaches a peak, and then the rot sets in and it goes back down again. Around that peak, it appears they just sort of like went, this is just going to go in the wrong way from here, and then they left and went back to Middle Earth.
Very smart.
So very smart, but also that seemed to be very much in tune with this kind of like feeling of they can see the future in a way that a lot of the wise can sort of get a feel for where things are going. So they're a fantastic and mysterious group that wonderfully Tolkien then leaves them alone at the end. They have this great role in The Lord of the Rings when they're there and they sort of let the Rohirim through, sort of lead them through their forest, which means that they don't have to fight the orcs, which means that they do get to the Battle of Pelennor Fields in time, and then we get that fantastic charge down, one of the best moments from the films, it has to be said. Then they charge down and them arriving at the same time nearly as Aragorn. That's what changes the battle. So they've got this fantastic role, but then Aragorn, after all of this, he's now the High King of most of Middle Earth, and he just says, you know what, thank you very much, Woses, wild men, whatever name you wish to take for yourselves, this area here, this is your land, and no one's allowed to enter it without your permission. And they seem to have gone, great, and that's the last we hear of them. Exactly. And that for me, it works really well. It's like there's no attempt to sort of say they then traded happily with it, because that's not what they're about. They were about just living in the forest by themselves.
It's what's kind of interesting is, I think it's also, if I remember correctly, in the films, but I think it's also in the books, when on the path to Dunharrow, where the or at least in this region where the people of Rohan have their camp of the army later. And if you go up this thing, you see little statues, and it's some assume these are the also statues of the or made in reminiscence of the appearance of the Druidine. And just a little detail. So they are somewhere in the mythology of, if you want, of some of those people. For example, the people of Rohan living there, or maybe even the hillmen and so on that lived also for a time in these hills. Speaking of the Oathbreakers and so on, And that's a really fascinating detail how these, I mean, if I would tell you, yeah, there's also this weird kind of men, and they have, when they get angry, their eyes glow, and they have, I don't know, this magic powers and so on, you would say, yeah, it's kind of strange. So they're very mythological figures in of themselves, and it's one of those mythological elements in Tolkien's world, like Tom Bombadil, for example. It's very interesting, in my opinion.
Yes, and this is one of the wonders, I think, of Tolkien's writings, that he doesn't try and explain everything. He accepts that in any world there will be things that we simply do not know and understand, and this is one of those things that we simply do not know everything there is to know, and that is okay. Reflective Rambling saying, I won't lie, I've listened to dozens of descriptions of the elven groups and I still get them all muddled up in my head. Do not worry, I'm exactly the same. Everyone's exactly the same. It is very complicated. At some point I will go through and do a video of it, but I'll have to take a deep breath and a large glass of wine first to work my way through it. It's, they break apart and come together, and they have slightly different names, and it is complicated. Do not worry too much about it. I don't think it affects your understanding of the story hugely, and you pick up on things slowly. Kai Johnson saying, could you explain what race Aragorn and Arwen's children would be and how long they would live? Arwen chose mortality, but she was still an elf by race. What about the offspring? Well, I do happen to know off the top of my head, Eldarion, their son, lived to 219 years. That's just one of those facts that you remember. Their children were humans, but obviously had the both Numenorian ancestry and Elven ancestry, so they were long-lived humans. But over time, the length of their lives diminished with each generation.
Yeah, that's
yes, so go on.
Interesting. Also an interesting topic. I think in Nature of Middle-earth, the new book, we also have some notes of Tolkien. I think it was also mentioned before, but I couldn't put my finger on where exactly that the basically inheriting the half-elven, being in half-elven, inheriting this is only given down like a few generations, and it stops for so Eldarion is not considered a half-elf anymore. Maybe because I'm not sure when because maybe Arwen's decision to become basically also counted towards men, and Aragorn of course too. So she can't give it. For example, even though that is also a complicated topic, let's not dive into this. The Elrond has a twin brother called Elros, and his son, I forgot the name, but I'm not sure if he is also considered half-elven. It's a very complicated topic.
Also, it is, but from that line comes the Numenorians, and similarly from there, it's almost like with each generation it matters less. Because each generation, so Elros lived for goodness knows how many hundreds of years, a long time. But each generation lived slightly less long than we reach Aragorn Aragorn and Aragorn.
But in this case, they are. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say. So by that stage, it's like a couple of hundred years, which is still long lived, but it's sort of just weakening with each generation.
The longevity for the Dunedain, I think Elros lived 500 or 450 years or something like this. He's maybe a very special case, but the longevity of the Dunedain in general, like Aragorn and so on, it's not because they are half-elven. It was like a special gift for the Dunedain for fighting in the War of Wrath with the Valar, and this is a really complicated topic we probably can talk about an hour for this. They potentially restored originally men might have lived longer, and then there was like a fall of men, and then their lifespan were reduced to what we know, 90 years, and the Dunedain basically got this lifespan restored to as it once was. But this is a really complicated and very philosophical topic in Tolkien's world. For those interested, also we find it in Nature of Middle-earth or Morgoth's Ring. there is a dialogue between Finrod and Andres and the tale of Adanel and so on. A very, very advanced Tolkien philosophical lore stuff there. Really complicated.
Absolutely. And I'll bring this back around by reflective rambling, picking me up on saying that what I would need before writing my video about all of the different types of elf is wine, saying, are you sure wine would help with that? It probably help me with name pronunciation when it comes to elves. Chris, this is something that people have been picking up on the chat as your pronunciation is hugely appreciated. Yeah.
Thank you. I try my best. But it's
good.
Not perfect, though.
Well, none of these things, and it's probably for those who are new to Tolkien. Tolkien obviously himself was a philologist. He was a language professor. He went into huge detail about how each different word should be pronounced. What I'm slightly more relaxed about this. You will find lots of people who are Tolkien purists who will pick up on these different things. As far as I'm concerned, if you try to pronounce it as best you can, that works for me. So that's where I'm at, and so I think we as content creators often fall into the trap of rolling our R's a huge amount when sometimes it isn't necessary. I know I do that as well. It makes it great, and it's probably exactly how it's spelt, but do not worry if you don't get the names exactly right all the time.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I remember when I started made my first Tolkien related video on my channel. It was like 2017. It was about also like a lore comparison with Shadow of Mordor. We talked about this, and then I went into the problem where how do I say these names? Like these Tolkien fans will rip me apart if I say them wrong. So I really went into Appendix E of Lord of the Rings and looked it up. And then now, forwarding 4 years later, I can't even say them somewhat normally anymore. Anglicize them anymore. But I don't blame anyone who
who
says
Englicize
them or whatever.
Let's not worry about it too much. We try our best, and that is all we can do. Captain Jack 1138, thank you very much for the super chat, saying hello, Robert, newest subscriber here and loving the content. Keep up the great work. Thank you. I very much appreciate that. David Oliver saying, I keep having images in my mind of a Tol Eressëa crashing into the Blue Mountains, splitting them up, and years later becomes the Grey Havens. It was a massive island with cities, towns, and villages. So this is the kind of thing. When I was talking about Tolkien's world shifts around, it does from age to age, and this is another thing which, when people dig into the Silmarillion, makes it really quite hard, is that even the geography feels very different from one part of the story to the next part of the story. And that is, it's sort of like when we're talking about Tolkien, you've mentioned this a few times, Chris, creating mythology. That is exactly what this is. And this is the world being changed and pushed and crashing into the right form. I don't know if there's anything you wish to sort of add to that in terms of what changes and how and why and what that might be sort of telling us, or whether it's just great sort of visuals.
Oh, it's I don't know. It's to return to the question. It's really the geography and how the world changes all the time. It's just such a very, very big topic. It is it's really difficult. Like just imagining, we talked about a moment ago, when the world becomes suddenly a sphere, then basically the continent Aman stays where it was, and then there's a straight line connecting it somehow. It's almost impossible to imagine, and it's not part of the physical world anymore, and so on. It's just fascinating. And when it comes to this question, it's Tol Eressëa. I can't remember exactly how this place was created. I think, let me just double check. There was the Isle of Valar in the First Age, and I think a part of it as a theory. I think that it became Tol Eressëa. It was bigger once, and it was used to basically transfer the elves from Beleriand over to Aman. So the elves were invited to Aman shortly after they awoke in Cuivienen. We talked about this, and they had to go to they needed to go over the ocean, and they had no boats or no boat technology that was sufficient at that point. So Ulmo, I think, and his Maya Osse probably formed like an island, and they could go on this island, and then the island would just, like a ship, go over to Aman and place them there, and then return and pick up others and so on. At least that's how I imagine it. And it's just very mythological in a way, but also a very, very interesting idea. And then this whole Beleriand west coast of Middle-earth got destroyed, and then the Blue Mountains were once part of it, very far into the land, far more east to the coast, and then it broke there, and the Blue Mountains became basically very close to the coast, and a part of it broke out, I think, where what is it called, Saren Athrat, or something like this. It was called, like, there was a river and there was a dwarf road through these Blue Mountains, and I think there, roundabout there, Mithlond, or the Lindon and Mithlond and so on, and then happened to be, because it, through the Valar, destroyed this Beleriand completely and was sunk into the ocean. Then it happened, but I don't remember Tol Eressëa crushing into the Blue Mountains, though.
Well, I mean, I think this is one of those things. If you'd come out with that extra level of detail there, that would have been a couple of live streams ago. I had Girl Next Gondor on, who suddenly stunned us all with being able to name all of the 12 houses of Gondolin, which is the extra level of nerddom. I'm always impressed by people who have this encyclopedic knowledge, and what you were displaying huge amounts of that with all the different geographical changes. I'm hugely impressed. I always love, you're right, with the imagery of the island boat, and particularly the way that we'll come away. This is a big digression, but the way that when they get on it, and then some of the elves say, right, that's fair enough, we'll just sit on here, we like this island. It's just the idea of an island boat sort of nipping across the ocean just to take some people. Fantastic. Let's go to a question from Catherine Furseth over on Patreon, saying, could you please explain how you see the theme and role of pity in the story of the Third Age? It is said that Gandalf learned the value of pity from Nienna, and that pity was the singular characteristic of hobbits that drew his attention to their value in the struggles with dark forces. What can be seen as weakness proves to be the most important strength of character. How do you see this thread of the importance of pity play out during the Third Age? Well, there's a very clear answer to this. I'd be interested in terms of the very specific instances. I'd be interested, Chris, whether you've got other instances of where this happens. But the pity is the word which is used, I'm sure, immediately sprung to everyone's minds when Gandalf is talking about how Bilbo treated Gollum. It was the pity of Bilbo that stayed his hand. And then again we hear, so Gollum would have been killed but for Bilbo's pity, and Gollum would have been killed but for Frodo's pity. And then right at the very end, actually Sam feels pity for Gollum and lets him go. And it's 3 times this pity is shown on Gollum. And but for that pity, he wouldn't have been there at the very end. And obviously, if Gollum hadn't been at the very end, then the ring wouldn't have been destroyed. So pity as a theme runs through there. But is there anything else that you would pick out in terms of pity, maybe attaching to Nienna there, or some or other instances in the Third Age?
Yeah, I think, as you point out, really the scene we know from Bilbo is also one of my favorite passages in the Lord of the Rings, where he also talks about that pity stayed his hand, and that Bilbo started his possession of the One Ring with pity and not with killing someone, was very important. That he maybe later was to some degree able to let go of the One Ring and so on. A very fascinating detail, but I think you find it in in a lot of places here and there with Frodo. I think it's very prominent, of course, in Lord of the Rings, as you already pointed out. But it's often, maybe if we think about many situations where pity was not shown, and for example, I don't know, if we think about Feanor, for example, like he had no regrets, no mercy, only had his oath in mind to retrieve his Silmarilli, and he even burned the boats and let the other Noldor who wanted to follow him walk over this icy hellscape. Yeah, that was next level mean. I mean, the wife of Turgon, who would later become also High King of the Noldor, died on this journey, which she was interestingly a Vanyar elf. Elenwe, I think was her name, and so no known Vanyar elf ever, so one of the three great elven clans, one of the Vanyar, ever entered Middle Earth, which is kind of interesting. There was another Vanyar elf, and she was not allowed to go. I think it was the girlfriend of Finrod, but that's if I remember correctly. But it's a total unrelated topic. There's definitely, for example, this where pity was not at hand, or this wisdom was not at hand. Like Feanor was very powerful, but he was not very wise in a way. And in Tolkien's world, it always feels like Gandalf is described as one of the wisest of the Maiar, and he learned what pity means from Nienna, and as a result, he has this wisdom. And for example, he has also this. He's very humble in a way. And for example, which I also really like, is that in the Unfinished Tales we get a bit more details how the Istari were found. And Gandalf was asked to go on this mission, and he said, "I fear Sauron. I should not go on this mission." And Manwë said then to him, "This is more reason to go on this mission, because you have the proper respect of this mission." And this always portrays him as very wise in this. That this all ties to this pity and mercy. If we go into, for example, the Hobbit and so on, you see that this wisdom, what Thorin does, is not really there, and at the end, everything gets far more complicated than it needs to be. If people would just talk to each other and have a bit more respect of each other, and maybe pity in the situations of others and so on. So there are definitely instances that you can see. Another thing would be maybe, what if we talked also about this, and that's maybe not that much to do with pity, but with what happens out of this. That there's this poor king Arvedui, the last king of Arnor, and he says, "Hey, let me be king of. Let take my claim of the kingship of Gondor serious." And I mean, it's a weird way to say, "Hey, we have pity with you. You can now become our king." But maybe a bit of a twisted thought. But if they would have went with this in the end, it would have been better, maybe even for Arnor and for Gondor, and things could have changed. But this was not what was done. They did not. They tried to help him, but they also had their own trouble. They couldn't help Arnor in time, and as a result, Arnor was done. It didn't exist anymore. The son of Arvedui, who survived, did not claim kingship of Arnor because there was nothing to rule over anymore after it, after the war against Angmar. And I think it's a very interesting nuance that appears time and time again in very different aspects, and always, I think the bigger topic is, I guess, some kind of wisdom of seeing what situation come. I think also an interesting thought is always, like, Elrond is a very interesting character in that regard, because Rivendell is like an interesting place where people meet a lot from all over the world. And he could also say, "Yeah, I'm also related to Thingol, and you killed Thingol. Dwarves are not welcome in Rivendell." But this would have had a huge impact on how it was, but how the world would have unfolded if that would have been the case. But he always had this, he always welcomed everyone, also the dwarves, even though in the past there were conflicts in his line with the dwarves, and at least to some degree, and that is, I think, also like some wisdom he does. He understands also the situation of the dwarves. He helps them out, even though the dwarves are probably also not always that friendly to elves. And we have this beautiful relationship of Legolas and Gimli too. That this old feud at the beginning that's then that especially in the film slowly devolves over the course of the films and into a deep friendship, and that, in my opinion, is very interesting. And we can also read in some versions that Gimli, I think it's also in the Lord of the Rings, also goes with Legolas to Aman later. So this shows how deep this friendship goes, and shows in a way the power of pity. In a way, all the life, everything Gandalf does, or a lot of it, has to do exactly with this. If he would have handled things differently, he would have probably have more foes and could have not reached people that well and bring them together to fight against Sauron. And he is the only, I guess, successful Istari, depending on the version regarding the Blue Wizards. You count as one version where they're also successful, and another one where they're not. But that's like a different topic. But he is, of the Istari we know well, he is the most successful, who basically managed to complete his mission. That is also tied to his wisdom and to learning about pity and respect and so on. It's, in my opinion, a very important lesson there.
There is, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's notable that Tolkien, when he was creating his pantheon, as it were, of the Valar, these are the great, the god creatures, which is probably not the most elegant way of saying it, but this is Iluvatar is the great god, but then he has delegated powers to rule and manage Arda to these Valar, and so they are the equivalent of sort of the pantheon of gods we see in sort of Greek or Norse mythology. And I always find it fascinating that Tolkien could have picked any kind of gods to have. You can have, god of thunder, you could have the god of nature, whatever. He has these other sorts of things, but he has this Nienna, who has responsibility for grief and tears and sadness and pity. And that is an astonishing thing, I think. If you had to, you're saying we're only allowing this small number of these different great sort of central characters with themes which will play out across all of Arda, and one of those is around grief and pity, and that, I always think that's an astonishing addition by Tolkien.
I fully agree with you there.
Let's go with a question from Lyle Howick, saying Lord of the Rings is regarded as the father of high fantasy today, yet magic and magical creatures like dragons and elves were all gone by the end of the Third Age. Why do you think Tolkien went this route? Why do you think that is, that he went as a magic decreasing rather than magic increasing, if that makes sense? It went from very high fantasy to, he's very clear that the future is lower fantasy.
Yeah, definitely. I think it has to do that, as said, that the original idea was that Tolkien's world is mythology for England, and we have like an interesting writing where we have an Anglo-Saxon king that goes on his ship. So from our real world, of course, a fictive character. It's not I'm not sure if he's a king, but like a character, an Anglo-Saxon lord, and on a ship, and he finds the straight road and goes to Aman and finds the elves there and talks to them. But the elves don't exist in this world. But the world is basically our world, but it's as a result completely demystified, if that's a term. And there's still this place outside of the boundaries of the world that you, on paper, on the magical road, can read like that. Becomes a fictional story again. So as a result, if the world is our world, of course it has to reduce its magic aspect, and the dragons have to be gone, and the Balrogs have to be gone, and the elves and the dwarves and so on at some point. And everything is leaving the world a bit, and only men stay and develop further. And the nature of Middle Earth, we also get the idea more clearly stated that that beyond, when Aman is not part of the world anymore, there's still like a new continent in the far west, which is America, then basically in his later ideas and so on. So that Arda slowly transforms into Earth, basically, and this of course needs this reduction of this.
It does, and it's not it's not a sort of a time shift. This isn't on a timeline. Tolkien was actually there's a wonderful, you can find it somewhere on YouTube, a recorded interview with Tolkien when he's asked about this question: is Middle Earth just our planet, but a long time ago? And his reply was, it's our planet in a different stage of imagination, a different era of imagination, which is a wonderful way of doing it. So the shift is, yes, this is sort of in the past, but it's also in a different kind of realm. This is in the realm of myth and imagination. And so the shift that happens in the Fourth Age, which is what happens after the story of the Lord of the Rings, is that's when the magic and everything's slowly receding away, and that's when humanity, the dominion of man, comes. Is that is when we are slowly transferring ourselves from that stage of imagination to where we are at now. Just picking up Reflective Rambling, thank you so much for pointing it out in the chat, and apologies for Plum Kettle, I missed your super chat, sorry about that. The question was, or the statement really, I could not get out of the Shire in the Lord of the Rings book. The hobbits kept breaking out into song. I can entirely understand that. This is one of the things that I've found that people say the most the first time they actually read the Lord of the Rings, if they've maybe watched the films, the movies, and then they get to read it, is quite how many songs there are randomly. They're there in The Hobbit, but then in the Lord of the Rings, it just seems to be almost all the time a character breaks out into song. I like that, but I understand, and I think that is part of the world that Tolkien is trying to create, but I can completely understand how that can break the kind of narrative flow for people. What's your take on all of the singing? Because it is noticeable, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, definitely noticeable. I think Tolkien definitely has like it's quite poetic at times, and wants to express this in his works too. And I think it's also kind of important, like from our today's perspective, I think songs, I wouldn't say are less important, but they have maybe gotten a different purpose than poems than they had. If you imagine a world full of mythology and of dragons, and especially where maybe not everyone can read, not everyone has access to books and so on, even though they exist, but this is very advanced technology already, a book. Then for your cultural identity, for the knowledge of the past, you need to give this to the next generation. And doing this through songs and poems is probably a very good way to do this, because you can memorize those better and keep them in mind. As a result, especially the hobbits constantly think of, okay, how can we one part process what we're experiencing here in our world, and on the other part maybe cheer us up in this dark situation that we probably get into. And the other way, we can memorize this and then put in a book and have this whole tradition of telling our adventures to other peoples in the future. Maybe it becomes part of Hobbit culture and so on. So I think this was maybe also different, like when Tolkien was born or was young and so on, even so 100 years ago and over 100 years ago. And this might be reflected by this. And I think we probably underestimate even how important this aspect is, if you want to tell a world somewhat believable in a way. So one could maybe ask, why don't other fantasy works don't rely so much on poems and songs in a way? But of course, I understand it's very special.
It
I like
is,
it.
and I think it's as I say, I like it too. I think that a lot of other fantasy worlds do have songs or bards in them in
Yeah,
this
that's true.
sense. So you get the Witcher obviously has
Yeah.
that Dandelion, where he goes by various different names according to the translation. We get Tom Merrilin in the Wheel of Time. George R. R. Martin often has a lot of songs that play quite an important role there in A Song of Ice and Fire. What Tolkien does though is that he writes out the whole song,
Yes.
which is it's quite different to how a lot of other. And what he does that you only I think start to get when you're sort of analyzing it is he is showing the culture of whoever it is who has written that song through the song.
Yes.
They are very, and because, as I say, he was a linguist and he loved poetry, he understood poetry, understood language. When you read, Sam comes out with some poetry with a song, it is very, the language usage is
Yes.
the kinds of things that he knows about, he understands. It's an expression of who he is. You compare that to the elves singing, it is a very, very different thing. Again, the dwarves, when they're singing about their lost treasure and Erebor, this is Tolkien's way of showing us, another way of showing us about who these people are who are singing these songs. So I entirely understand if it takes you out of the narrative, but I also understand why Tolkien included it.
And it's, maybe also to add to this, one little detail is, of course, that the word and also the song has power in the world of Tolkien. Like, if we think about, there is an ancestor of Elrond and Aragorn, that is Luthien, and she faces Sauron at one point, and they have also, the brother of Galadriel did face Sauron at one point. They had basically a battle of song, if you want, of songs of power that had like very potent magic in them, if you want. And the world is also created through music, the music of the Ainur. And so the music and song and spoken word, as for example, also in the Bible, if you would compare to this, where also the spoken word of God has a very great power. Same in Tolkien's world. So that adds to this, why this culture of the spoken word and of the song is so important and tied deep into the world of Tolkien.
Yes, and there's a link, I think, here also with this next question from Mara Lee, with Legolas, about Legolas. When Legolas and his companions met with Gandalf as Gandalf the White, Gandalf delivered a message to Legolas from Galadriel, that began with, "Legolas Greenleaf, long under a tree, enjoy thou hast lived, beware of the sea." What did Galadriel mean by giving Legolas this message, and why should Legolas beware of the sea? I mean, perhaps you could sort of turn the two around there, perhaps, Chris. There's clearly a straight answer, I think, to this, but then there's an extra layer. Now, why should Legolas beware the sea? But also, why was Galadriel telling him that, do you think?
That's a very interesting question, though. Of course, the beware of the sea is that Legolas, as related to the woodland realm with his father Thranduil, it's always, you never have the impression that the woodland realm really is planning leaving Middle Earth anytime soon. And of course, on this journey and experiencing everything in this that Legolas is in, his longing for the sea, to cross the sea and go to Aman too, is probably increasing. And after all these adventures later, he also sails over to Aman and builds his own boat even, and potentially takes Gimli with him. And that is probably what she wants to express here, that he long had the joy in Middle Earth, living under the tree. He has lived long already in it, but beware that there will be a time of change when you have to leave this place. Keep this in mind, that the journey you are undertaking will induce this further inside of you. And also, it's also like a poem, which definitely again shows like who Galadriel is, who shows also cultural identity to the elves, who like in Elrond's place, for example, there was always like poem and song. It was a place of poems and songs, also a place of recording history. So you see how even the oral tradition and the written tradition basically fuse there a little bit, if you want, and really fascinating. And of course, she also sends him this little poem as a message, and potentially as a part of her foresight, as part of wisdom, but also part of the elven tradition, which is also what he speaks about. It is elven tradition to leave Middle Earth at one point. That makes sense.
Absolutely. I don't think there's anything much I can add to that. I think we could go down with breaking down different kinds of elves and Legolas's background, but I think I'm not going to go down that road for fear of taking us into about a 15th hour. Caius Ballerina, thank you so much for picking up a question from Narion, saying, what happened around Dol Guldur in the Third Age? Was it some kind of enclave from where the orcs attacked the neighboring countryside? Yes. So we sort of touched on this a couple of times, but we've come at it from a number of different angles. So what I'll do is give the central narrative, if that makes sense. So Dol Guldur was a place in southern Mirkwood. It was a fortress. I think it was also caves under there as well. This was where Sauron, when he was, after the ring had been cut from his finger for 1,000 years, he was basically a disembodied spirit. This was the place that he chose to set up camp once more. And when he was there over the course of a long period of time, a couple of millennia, he attracted dark things, evil to him. And so at the time, it wasn't called Mirkwood. This was Greenwood the Great. This was a fantastic, beautiful forest. And it started to be called Mirkwood because of the spreading influence of evil out there. He took on the name the Necromancer. That's what people knew him as. They didn't know it was Sauron. Eventually, Gandalf and Elrond started getting suspicions about this, but they thought maybe this is one of the Nazgul, maybe it's someone else. There's definitely something bad and evil going on there. And you'll remember, I think one of the things that I quite liked about the Hobbit movies, there are many things that many of us would sort of query about it, but one of the things that I did love was the way that they tried to draw in what does this actually look like, and you get Radagast, who lived on the edges of Mirkwood, and then you probably remember there was I think there were like spider things crawling all over, and he was there. There's something dark going on here in that is the feeling we've got, is that there's a darkness spreading out from it. Now, eventually, it took a couple of goes. Gandalf went in a couple of times to have a look at it. They tried to persuade Saruman to come in and attack. He was having none of it for a while, but eventually Sauron gets pushed out. But this is still a nexus of focus for sort of where the dark things have gathered. And so what you'll find is that then when we get to the events of the Lord of the Rings and the War of the Ring, yes, this is a hub. We get orcs raiding out. They go and try and attack north into northern Mirkwood, take on Thranduil and things like that. So is this a base? Yes, it's a base. And it was originally, this was Sauron's hiding place. So it's a really important sort of part of Third Age history. Is there anything you'd like to add to that before I sort of move on, Chris?
Yeah, that's basically it. Later, I think Carmul is stationed there with potentially another Nazgul, and they do attacks to Lothlorien and Thranduil and fight there a little bit, and then Galadriel just destroys this place at the end. So yeah, it's basically a base. This is really difficult to put into one version because you have to derive it from different texts that partially contradict each other. That maybe this place was once Amon Lang, where the woodland, so Thranduil's people once lived, with maybe Thranduil or his father as king, and was called Amon Lang. But it's very, very complicated to unite Amon Lang with Dol Guldur and the history of Thranduil's people. That's very complicated. I went through this a bit in my current project I'm currently working on, and it's really complicated. Like lot of things. People sometimes do this so easily, but it's really complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Question from Reflective Rambling, actually picking up something for Gigi Quillian, saying, Robin, Chris, thank you so much for the time you've given us. If I had a wish these days, it would be to sit in the chair you occupy. Namarie. Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure. Thinking very literally right now, you would not want to be sitting in this chair. It's not very comfortable. This is one of my New Year plans. I'm going to be getting one of those funky sort of gamer chairs. Any recommendations, let me know. But I don't know whether that was you saying you were thinking about being a content creator, but I would just happily encourage you to join. There is a wonderful little community of Tolkien content creators who I'm very happy to say seem to generally get along with each other and try and be as supportive as you can, which is a wonderful thing. So if you were wanting to, then just feel free to shoot me or any other content creators that you know sort of a message or something on Twitter, and I'm sure if we can help out and give you any support, we would love to. So thank you for that.
Shout out to Gigi.
Sorry?
Shout outs to Gigi. Also know her from my live streams and so on.
Oh, excellent. Well, there you go. If you're already a fan of the Mighty Chris, this is excellent start. Let's go to question from one of my patrons saying, what do we know about the so-called Black Numenorians and their role in Middle-earth, especially in Umbar and the South? Also, what do we know of slavery in Middle-earth? I can sort of tie these together at a high level. The Black Numenorians, such as they're called, basically is when we had Numenor as this great kingdom, an island kingdom, they were particularly in the second, well, they were always a sea-loving people, particularly in the sort of the second, in the descent down. Then they started landing in Middle-earth and creating these small kingdoms, starting to take over lands in Middle-earth. And some of them, particularly around the areas that became sort of Umbar and that area sort of towards the south of Gondor, they were taken over by some Numenorians. This is before the fall of Numenor. And Numenor had two groups. The King's Men, who they supported the kings who were part of this long, slow downfall of Numenor, and then you get the Faithful, which is where Elendil and Isildur and all of their kin came from. Now, it was the King's Men who were there, who we might, at a very high level, call the baddie Numenorians. They headed off and landed and founded some settlements and the like, and they later became known as the Black Numenorians. Now, so that's where they come from. And there was a very long, all the way through the Third Age, there was this very long history of problems between Umbar, Haradrim, towards the south to the south of Gondor and Gondor itself, which is a kind of a carrying on from what happened on Numenor. So that's the sort of the high level of what was going on. And that is also where a huge amount of where we have slavery. It seems not to have been so much in, they obviously didn't have it in the Shire, it wasn't in Arnor, it wasn't in Gondor, but down in the east and the south, all of this control over other people, this all comes from Sauron's influence, Morgoth's influence, the rings. If you think about it, that's actually a form of slavery. It was about controlling whoever was wearing the other rings. The ring wraiths don't any longer have their own will. They are doing the will of Sauron. And we hear about slaves right at the very end. Basically, there's this whole land full of slaves that Aragorn frees after the end of the Lord of the Rings. But is there anything else you'd like to sort of pick up on in terms of either the slavery aspect or the Black Numenorian aspect?
Yes, Umbar in general is a very interesting place, when also in context with the Black Numenorians. And the only thing I might add there is that, as you said, the Kingsmen, when the Numenor's active time, went into this region, and they put, I think it's worded like, they put heavy tribute on those people in the southern region. So whatever that means, but it could, especially this was at a time when Numenor's politics got a bit darker, let's put it that way. It might have also included slavery, and the Black Numenorians probably, as Kingsmen, still went with these darker themes of Numenor after Numenor was destroyed there. So yeah, but this is a basic outline what the Black Numenorians do, and yeah, some might be related to the Nazgul. So there's a mention that some Numenorians or Numenorian lords also became Nazgul, but who exactly and what is always hard to reconstruct.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So there's a lot that perhaps that could be something I could do. I've been thinking, actually, if you've got any ideas, once in the new year, what I've finished going through the history of Middle Earth, trying to have a think about what other topics for Lord of the Rings Middle Earth live streams to have. If you've got any thoughts, do drop them either in the chat or down in the comments and underneath the video if you're watching a little bit later. I'm open to any ideas, to be honest. Kai Johnson just in the chat saying, what do you think, or why do you think people have far less questions about Lord of the Rings as they do for A Song of Ice and Fire? What is the difference, and why is Game of Thrones so open-ended compared to Lord of the Rings? It's an interesting question. I think the one big difference between, well, first of all, I'm not 100% sure. From my experience, people have a huge amount of questions about Lord of the Rings as well. But the big difference between the two is A Song of Ice and Fire isn't finished, whereas Lord of the Rings is. So the types of questions tend to be slightly different. Just trying to act as an observer of what happens in my own live streams as much as anything else. The types of questions about Tolkien's world appeared to be a lot more about trying to understand what is happening. Tolkien created this astonishingly rich, detailed, and varied world, and people, I think, have got this great appetite to just understand more about it. When it comes to A Song of Ice and Fire, there are still a huge amount of questions about what on earth is going on and how will it finish. So they seem to be different types of questions in my experience anyway. Rob's Memory Lane, thank you so much, saying, I love your channel. Very cool to see the face behind the voice. My wife and I watch all 6 Hobbit and Lord of the Rings movies every Christmas. That's an excellent. I try to watch the Lord of the Rings movies at least once a year, but I don't have a particular time of year to do it. And so also saying, thank you again. Another one saying, huge fan of the Philosopher's Games channel, aren't we all? I hope you'll do a face reveal sometime as well. Keep up the great work, both of you. Loving seeing you both. Well, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to do a face reveal, Chris. I'm very aware that some people do not wish to for whatever reason. But yeah, if you ever do want to, if you ever do want to, my channel is yours to do a face reveal on. And then finally, another question from Rob's Memory. Thank you very much for this. Saying, do you think Tolkien ever read Robert T. Howard's Conan? Well, he was a very well-read man. I don't know, Chris, maybe you know. I don't remember him ever commenting on it. But it certainly was around during Tolkien's time. The thing with Conan, though, is I would say is these tended to be when they were published, they were pulp fiction stories that I'm not 100% sure whether that's the kind of thing which would have come across Tolkien's rather erudite radar.
Probably not.
only later, really, when we started the Conan started getting into comic books, and then obviously we had the movies, the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, that Conan became a lot bigger in many ways with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yeah, I mean, I love the first Conan film.
The
it's
first Conan film is very interesting.
So ridiculous, it's fun. But yeah, I'm reading any Robert E. Howard stuff.
Currently, not really, but it's kind of interesting. Maybe I remember this wrong. Maybe I have to look this up. Let me just. Probably it's too difficult to look it up. But isn't the writer of the film, of the Conan film, the first one, wasn't that the same one who also wrote Apocalypse Now?
I honestly have no idea.
I don't know it either.
Okay,
I would have to look it up.
This is the kind of thing that the chat is good for. If you're here in the chat,
maybe somebody knows it in the chat.
Feel free to. There's always a cleverer person than me in the chat somewhere, cleverer and more knowledgeable. But I think the short answer is probably Tolkien may well have been aware. We have no idea whether he read it. I certainly don't think that he's talked about it. Lil King saying, "You have made Lord of the Rings mean so much more to me beyond the amazing films. I have so much lore from it. Thanks to you." Well, thank you very much. I hugely appreciate that. I've got 3 more questions from my patrons. So now is a good time to drop any final questions in the chat. A question from Jeffrey of Clan Gun. Did the characters outside of the Fellowship, like the soldiers of Rohan, soldiers of Gondor, know about the One Ring and the plan or plot to destroy it? What do you reckon, Chris? Did the normal everyday soldiers of Gondor know about all of that stuff?
That's a fascinating question. If they knew, I don't know. These supernatural beings, it's very hard to say if they are, how much they are connected, or how people are connected to them. There's some interesting details about, for example, there is the dialogue, I mentioned it, between Andres and Finrod, and that's also about you learn a bit that the men of this early time had a very vague understanding of who the Valar are and who God is, and I think it's not really clear how well that is, how this changed potentially over time. But if we then jump to the Second Age, for example, the Númenóreans, of course, the kings, they could call to, for example, Eru for specific oaths, and it was later done. So I assume that they definitely had some knowledge of these higher entities, and how, for example, I don't know, Tom Bombadil or so is known outside the Shire, probably not that much, because the idea behind him is like mythology that is slowly fading away, and so on. So he's probably a bit outside of this. So if the everyday soldier of Gondor knew about this, is pretty hard to say, to be honest. I think to some degree, but probably not that precise.
Yeah, I mean, I think they will have known the legends, but in terms of the plan that we're going to go and lead an army up to the gates of Mordor, not because we think we might get anything out of this, but because actually secretly there's 2 hobbits trying to find their way to destroy the ring, that they wouldn't have shared with everybody. I think that's the kind of thing that really only the commanders would, because they did not want in any way, shape or form Sauron to suddenly think, hang on a moment, maybe I shouldn't push all of my forces out and leave Mount Doom unguarded. I think they would have probably kept that information quite tight. The chat, incidentally, is suggesting John Milius as the screenwriter for.
Yes. I also looked it up a bit in parallel.
You. I've got that, and actually, you were in the chat saying this, so you've looked this one up. Excellent. And just one other thing, while I think of it, on Conan, for those Conan fans, I'm a fan of Conan. Some of it does read quite dated now. It has to be said when you reread it, but the stories themselves are often excellent. Conan is, in case you're interested, one of those. There are a few different, what we might now call proto franchises that have been bought up by Netflix. Netflix have bought the rights to make a TV show based on Conan.
Oh, interesting.
Whether that happens, I don't know. We've not heard anything about it. They've also got the rights to Narnia. That's gone quiet. They bought that about 3 years ago now. We had a name attached to it, but nothing has emerged. There's also, I think, Redwall, if you're a fan of the Brian Jack stories as well. That's there. So there's quite a lot of beloved fantasy franchises or stories that are being brought up behind the scenes. Do keep an eye out for that. If I ever find out any information on where any of those things have got to, I will definitely let you know. You mentioned Tom Bombadil a moment ago, though, and Mara Lee had a question about Tom Bombadil, which is, why do you think Tolkien included the character in the books, and what is his and his wife's, Goldberry's, significance to the story? You sort of started answering that. What's your take? Everybody's got a take on Tom Bombadil. What's your take on why he's there?
So I recently had the question also on my live stream. I think I gave a very long answer to this, so I tried to shorten it down a bit. But it's a topic you can definitely discuss for hours. It's one of those very special things. But why did he include it? So from a writing perspective, I guess often people say like an editor these days would definitely kick it out of the book. And but Tolkien insisted that it stays in the book, of course. And it is a very old idea. Tolkien came up with the idea of Tom Bombadil a long time ago. He also published like a poem book a little with the adventures of Tom Bombadil, with some poems about him, also quite interesting. But yeah, Tom Bombadil is, there's like my take to it is, just look at let me see which letter it is. It's letter 19, and it's to his publisher Stanley Unwin, and it's kind of interesting. He asks Unwin a question: do you think Tom Bombadil, the spirit of the vanishing Oxford and Berkshire, I think it's pronounced, countryside, could be made into a hero of a story? So he asks him this, and he basically adds a bit of information: the spirit of the vanishing Oxford and so on countryside. That is basically what Tom Bombadil, I think, as an idea inside the world is. He's like the spirit of something, of a countryside, of a spirit, and Goldberry is just part of it. She's related to the rivers and the river aspect of maybe these countrysides, and they just basically are like a mythological or a manifestation or a personification of this aspect of nature that Tolkien misses, that is old and traditionally, and maybe vanishes slowly over time through maybe means of industrialization and so on. If we think of the forest Tom Bombadil lives in, which is the old forest, we can read that it was originally much, much bigger. It went from, let's say, the northern parts where also the Shire and Bree is and so on, all the way down to Isengard, Isengard even being connected to Fangorn Forest and so on. And Ents were maybe walking around there, and it vanished and vanished and vanished, and it's like a little small island that remains. And as a result, the mythology, this huge, once ancient mythology of this mystical creature that's a manifestation of a countryside, slowly is pushed back to this small forest, still very potent and powerful inside this aspect of this countryside that still exists in the form of the old forest, but it's also contained to it in a way. And because it simply is cut off from everything, like, I don't know, in the like the village of Asterix in the comics against the Roman Empire, basically a bit like this. And this is how I see it. In addition, we also sings a lot. we talked about how the importance of song in Tolkien's world that is also tied to it. In addition, we talked also about the music of the Ainur, and I really like the idea that he is some kind of personification or manifestation of a certain aspect of the music of the Ainur. It's very pure and it's very maybe close to the original concept of the world, and so his world is basically like not like an anachronism, basically the opposite of this, and it's basically fallen out of time, a specific place that has something of very old and ancient. We can read that Tom Bombadil is even maybe longer on Middle Earth than even Morgoth, so it goes way back into the creation of the world itself, and that is I assume what Tolkien might have meant with his character, even though I know there are bazillions of theories how you could understand. But I really like the aspect that he's a certain aspect of the music of the Ainur, and Tolkien started with it also in The Hobbit when he implemented the necromancer there, and he didn't explore this. It's just a mention, and also Gandalf mentions his cousin Radagast that lives close by to Beorn and so on. So Tolkien always had this idea of creating like something in the distance and mentioning it, and it feels suddenly the world feels much bigger than it might actually be. In these cases, of course, Tolkien already started writing his mythology and just took certain elements out of it and placed them inside the Hobbit and so on. And even this is a very complicated topic which can be discussed in tons of detail, but he already started with this, and I think that is again something he wanted to do with Lord of the Rings. We said that Tolkien does not explain everything when we talked about the Druidine, for example, a while ago, and but Tolkien sometimes tells you a lot. Like he finds a really good balance between not telling you anything and having these aspects that just make the world big and mysterious and mystical and enigmatic at times, in this case with Tom Bombadil. But at the same time, he also gives you a very precise and detailed world that has a lot of depth. And he balances, in my opinion, perfectly, which is, in my opinion, why Tolkien is such a great writer and his work is so beloved. And Tom Bombadil is definitely an expression of this aspect of the world, to show you there is simply more than just the Shire, this little village. The Shire itself is also an anachronism in the world. They have like a mail, and they have, I don't know, a clock and so on the wall, which is a clock on the wall is relatively advanced technology if you think about it. And they fall a bit out of the time if you compare this, for example, to, I don't know, Rohan or something. And then right next to this anachronism, you have basically the antithesis and the oh, that's a hard to say word. The opposite of this. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, and I think I would find it hard to disagree with most of that, to be honest. Tom Bombadil's a fantastic character, and Tolkien gives us just a few hints, I think. We were talking about how many songs there are in The Lord of the Rings. You can double that, treble that when it comes to Tom Bombadil. He's always singing. And I think that is, as you say, quite a big hint that he's central to the Song of the Ainur, which is what created this world, and it's almost like he is an expression of it. We get also this when we're seeing the Council of Elrond, and I think it's Elrond himself when they were discussing the potential for, what if they gave the ring to Tom Bombadil, and they basically decide they shouldn't, because he would forget about it or lose it or something like that. And then there's a sort of line about, but what if Sauron comes? Could Tom Bombadil stop him? And the answer is no. He will be there to the last. He will be, and when the Middle Earth descends into darkness, that is when he will go. So it's like he is this ardor unmarred, as you were talking about a bit earlier. That is what he is. He is the expression of Middle Earth, and in a kind of a very practical way, one bit that I love, which we almost miss, is this when they're on their way back, the hobbits are going back to home. Gandalf stops off to talk to Tom Bombadil, and he says, I've never been able to talk to him before because we've not had anything to talk about because I've always been doing things, and he's just there being Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if Gandalf is saying Tom Bombadil is just an expression of here and now and enjoyment and life and Middle Earth and just being. That's what he is. And that fits in with what Tolkien seemed to say. He said, this is saying something that I think is important and should be there. I can't quite put it in words, but it's an important part of this world.
It's just so much greater than everything else in a way, if that makes sense.
It is, and yet all completely anachronistic. And I completely understand Peter Jackson not including him in the movies. It would have been a very different start to that film. Rob's Memory Lane saying, any plans to cover Conan or Witcher material on either of your channels? I hope you two collaborate again soon. I've watched both all of your Lord of the Rings videos. Oh, well, thank you very much indeed. In terms of me, I noticed Reflective Rambling you saying you should also promote your own Conan readings for those not in the chat. Thank you. My moderators are always reminding me to promote my stuff because I always forget. I have got a second channel, for those who do not know, where I read audiobooks. I'm absolutely passionate about sharing the greatest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written for free for anyone who wants to listen to them. It's available as a podcast. It's available as a YouTube channel. It's called The Well Told Tale. There will be a link somewhere down in the description or in the chat or somewhere like that. And I've done 2, maybe 3 different Conan stories. They're fantastic. I can tell you, to read them, the vocabulary and mastery of language that Robert E. Howard is astonishing. It's very much of its own style, and always bombastic, always exactly how you imagine Conan to be, wonderfully worded. So I would highly recommend that. In terms of, you asked for this channel, I'll throw to you in just a second, Chris, for your channel. But in terms of this channel, if they make a Conan TV show, then yes, absolutely, I would love to cover that. That's still a good few years away from happening, I'm sure. As for The Witcher, yes, this is one of the things I will be covering on this channel. Expect in about a week's time a lot of Witcher content magically appearing on this channel. So I will cover season 2 in full. Chris, how about you? Are you just going to be doing Lord of the Rings, or are you branching into other things?
Yeah, I guess I mainly do Lord of the Rings stuff. I still have like this insanely long Who is Elrond video, which I only have one part that is already 2 hours. Then the second one is in the work, will be 2.5 hours, and then I'm still not done. So there's that, and I have a series going through the complete book that will probably keep me busy for a few years. So I guess it will be mostly Lord of the Rings, with maybe some experiments. I did a little video about cyberpunk once, about the subgenre, which I also want to do a part 2 about. So maybe some experimental things like this. And on my gaming channel, of course, I do this like little side project too, bit of gaming here and there when something comes up that interests me or so. But yeah, of course, when the Lord of the Rings Amazon series, or Lord of the Rings related Amazon series, I hated that there's no actual title for it.
I know, it's annoying.
It's really annoying. And yeah, probably I will dive into this, maybe also do like a lore comparison or something, see what the differences are, go into very huge amounts of detail into it, and then probably be busy with it a couple of years or so. I don't know. Will be mostly that. I think I'm so deep into Lord of the Rings and love the universe so much, have so much passion for it. I don't see me diving into any other universe anytime soon, though. I would love to maybe do a video at some point far in the future about maybe the inspirations for Tolkien, and maybe looking up some very old proto-fantasy books and so on that are around. Maybe also looking into a Conan and so on. Be interesting.
It would, and I'm sure you would get many people interested in your thoughts on them. Reflective Rambling, picking up a question from Mark Shisa, saying, would Gandalf have been successful in his mission without the Ring of Fire? Shout out to Kurdan's foresight. And the chat is wondering if our guest would indulge us and say squirrel. Which, well, just on that latter point, I haven't seen the build up to this. As I say, the chat often moves too quickly for me to do that. I would take this as a compliment if I were you, Chris. They often ask me to say a completely random word that amuses them. I think this is their way of saying you are welcome and at home here. Maybe it's to do with the rolling of the R's thing. I'm not sure. But I will throw this one over to you if you wish to amuse the chat and say the word squirrel. You can. But there's a serious question there about Gandalf and whether he would have succeeded without the Ring of Fire.
I think the word is relatively hard to say for Germans. I think it's squirrel, like this. Squirrel,
yeah, squirrel,
squirrel,
yeah.
squirrel.
Yeah. Squirrel.
It's really kind of not that easy, to be honest. And to the question, would he have been successful without the ring? So that's a really good question, to be honest. We know that the ring Naria had the ability of basically inspiring the hearts of others in times of darkness. And as a result, this totally fits for Gandalf. Like, it's a perfect fit. Gandalf inspires so many hearts and tries to connect people and tries to push people to certain directions and so on. And I think it would have been definitely a lot more difficult without this particular ring at hand, and quite literally. And would he have been still successful? That's difficult to say. Maybe not, because I feel like in the end it was still very close. But on the other side, Sauron did not really expect that the One Ring would be in Mordor, and I guess he could have convinced Frodo to take the ring to Mordor too, and as a result, the ring might have been still destroyed, even with Gandalf not having the ring Naria, but maybe at a much, much higher cost in Middle Earth itself when it comes to lives and so on. I could imagine that there would be probably a lot more trouble, and the end would be probably a lot darker as a result without it.
Yeah, I this is quite a hard one to answer. Yeah. I think. I mean, it's an excellent question, but it's quite hard because we know that the ring is incredibly powerful, but at the same time, its power, like all of Gandalf's powers, is quite hard to see the effect of sometimes. It's there for the encouragement of him as well as those around him. And so how do you gauge the power of that ring? I mean, you can, and I did a little mini study on this actually a while ago. You can look how the characters are feeling when Gandalf is no longer there. Suddenly we get all of these feelings of hopelessness and can they really do this that they didn't seem to have when he was there. Then you can also see there's like when in the Siege of Minas Tirith in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and Gandalf sort of rides through, and you kind of get the impression that the soldiers gain heart from his presence. And did that swing the battle? I mean, it definitely helped. So it's quite hard to tell exactly what it definitely, it seems, if you can kind of like imagine it, it's never perfect analogy, but like a sort of, if you imagine a D&D spell that has this sort of a radius around a person where everybody's getting sort of morale boosters and so their willpower checks improve or whatever, that's the kind of feel that's Tolkien seems to be giving. He wasn't obviously thinking about D&D when he was writing this, but that's the kind of feel, is that wherever Gandalf is, people are encouraged and they're enthused. And you can't say what the overall impact is. Did that make a difference? Seriously, how happy would people have been to be marching to the gates of Mordor and knowing they were facing hopeless odds without him there? I don't know. It's a very hard question to answer, but definitely it had an impact. Rob's Memory Lane asking, was Der Ring des Nibelungen, this is Wagner's Ring Cycle, discussed at all during the stream? No, it has not been discussed. I'm not an expert, though I'm hoping Chris might be. Chris, can you help me from flailing around and giving some half answers on this one?
I could try. I'm not the hugest also expert on the opera of Wagner, but it's composed out of course, old Germanic mythology, and it's also like there's also this the ring, der Ring der Nibelungen in it, and many speculate that it's quite similar to Lord of the Rings in certain aspects. I'm not sure how true that actually is, because one has to also see the evolution of the One Ring, like when there's the the first edition of The Hobbit that came out in 1937, and there the Riddles in the Dark chapter was a bit different. There Gollum basically gave the One Ring, which was just a magic ring that made you invisible, as a reward for winning the game, and then he didn't find it because Bilbo found it already, and then he says, then just show me the exit, and he shows him the exit, which is different than in the second edition, which is from I think 1951, and it was changed a bit to fit to Lord of the Rings, because after The Hobbit and writing a sequel to The Hobbit with The Lord of the Rings, the ring evolved into this One Ring concept, but I have no information about if this is really how much Der Ring der Nibelungen is tied to this, to be honest. I think it's not mentioned, so I would assume maybe it's just a coincidence, because in the mythology itself, like in Northern mythology, I'm not an expert on Old Norse mythology, but from what I know, I don't remember a ring to be also big of a deal there. And Northern mythology definitely had an impact on Tolkien's writings as well, same as, of course, Greek mythology and so on. There are a lot of influences from all kinds of mythology, Celtic mythology and so on, you find in Lord of the Rings. And since considering that in the very early versions, the ring still existed, but the concept of the One Ring was not there yet and was just developed later. It is, of course, possible in all cases, but I would say it's just like an accidental development that maybe has some resemblance to that. That makes sense.
It does, and I think the although I hugely appreciate Wagner, I'm not an expert, but my general take on this one, I would say, is that I would agree that Norse mythology is sort of the heart of all of this. Tolkien clearly took huge amounts of inspiration from it. So did Wagner, and that is where the sort of triangle goes. It's not so much that Tolkien saw or listened to Wagner and was like, "Oh yeah, that's great. I'll get into Norse mythology." It's that they were both inspired by the same thing rather than anything else. And while we're on the musical world, Rob's Memory Lane also asking, favorite Lord of the Rings inspired Led Zeppelin song, which is I don't no idea whether you're a Led Zeppelin fan. I'll go first on this one. I do like Led Zeppelin, and for those who are unaware, Led Zeppelin do reference the Lord of the Rings in some of their songs. There are references off the top of my head. There's a reference to the Nazgul, and also Gollum gets mentioned at least once. I think Ramble On is one that mentions quite a lot of Tolkien stuff. Are you a Led Zeppelin fan?
Not really, I have to admit, but not that I oppose the music or anything. I think even I like more rock music. I wasn't aware that he references Lord of the Rings, so that makes it quite interesting. Maybe I should look deeper into this. The only band I know that references Lord of the Rings a lot is, for example, a German metal band called Blind Guardian. So they have like some songs about this. There would the
Well,
Bards
I
song,
must
for
admit,
example,
I'm not au fait with their work, but I think also another one came to mind: the Battle of Nevermore. I think off the top of my head, and I hope I haven't got this wrong. I think it's an oblique reference to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. So that's where we're at. But yeah, so Tolkien does influence a huge amount of excellent music. I've got one more question from my patrons. And then I'll pick up any more things in the chat. This is Dylan saying, the granddaddy of all great fantasy worlds is Middle-earth. My question is, what makes Tolkien's world work? What are the fundamental foundations? I know this is less of a third age question and more of an overall literary question, but Lord of the Rings live streams allow me to ask these questions. So what I'd save this one for the end. Because I thought it feels like quite a sort of an all-encompassing one. What for you? What is it that that makes this world work? What is it that makes it transcend so many of these other kind of fantasy worlds that we have out there? What makes you so fascinated by it?
Yeah, so there are multiple aspects that really fascinate me about it. I think as a philologist, Tolkien had a very deep understanding of language, and he understood maybe more than a lot of other people, maybe even still to this day, but like probably hard to say, that language is very, very important for a world. Like it's very important for cultural identity. They have different languages, but also Tolkien does not invent fantasy words and made a language out of it. He also created like history, how those language developed over time, and this is reflected by his works. And suddenly certain names change, maybe some pronunciation changes here and there, and so on. And this amount of detail, and also always the names Tolkien, I think, chooses for places are so fitting in so many ways and feel kind of natural. And but not only that, we talked about the poems, about the songs, and so on. So Tolkien's really good at just building his world on huge amounts of very solid foundation of language and cultural identity, and differentiating different cultures and explaining how they work and make them believe. But each different culture does not just feel like somebody placed or dropped something like this culture out of nowhere into the world, and then it's just there, and it feels deeply connected to the world. And I think that is what Tolkien really does well. Like, I think it was also Tom Shippey, the very famous Tolkien scholar, who once said that you can always ask the question, who's that and why is that? And you find in 99% of the cases an answer to this. And then you can answer, okay, he had a grandfather and he did that. What did he do? What's his story? And then you also find an answer to this. You can go quite deep. You can zoom in quite deep into Tolkien's world. And that is definitely what fascinates me most, that I have questions. The world is built in a way that I have questions, but I can also ask those questions and find interesting answers to them. That he does. And we talked about the balance of having enigmatic mythology that is not explained, like not all questions are answered, but also incredibly in-depth answers to other fields. So it makes it believable that there are some parts of the world that you can't explain well, but it's not like it's always the case. And somehow, I don't know how, probably because it took this man a lifetime to work this all out, he managed to connect every red line in the end, like a lot of red lines at least, to a very fascinating and one of the best endings, in my opinion, I've ever read. Like it's moving, it's touching, it's deep, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah, and I think for me, I would agree completely. I think for me, the thing I would add to that is this works because whereas some writers, most fantasy writers, create a story, and then if that is a success, they then create a world around that. Tolkien did the complete opposite. He created a world over many decades, and then what came out of that as an offshoot is The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. They aren't. If you asked him what is his great act of creation, it would be the world, the Silmarillion. Then you get The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are kind of the offshoots from that. So when you read those stories, that's when you get the benefit of this extra layer of history and knowledge and background, because that those stories aren't the center point. They're just stories within this wider universe. Okay, and I think with that, I'm going to start rounding this up because I've just noticed the time. It's about it's 1:45 here, and I know that you're on German time, so you're even later over there. But I did want to give a big thanks to the chat, to the moderators as well. And Chris, thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to just let people know where they can find you on the net?
Yeah, so if you had not enough of my ramblings here, not annoyed by it already, then I also have a YouTube channel, The Philosopher's Games, where I at this time mostly cover Tolkien-related things. Usually I'm known for making very in-depth and unnecessary long videos, and that take a long time to produce. So if you're into this, currently working on a video about Elrond in the Second Age, covered Elrond in the First Age and his ancestors already, and there will be another 1 or 2 parts about Elrond in the Third Age in the future. So that's like several hours of content. Currently my whole focus is on this, so I basically forgot that I do anything else beyond this. Well, besides this, I had, as mentioned, also a gaming related channel where I did like little reviews or whatever, comments, first impressions on what's going on in the gaming industry. And I'm also on Twitch, streaming like Sundays, usually sometimes Thursdays if possible. Also as a side project, I play some games bad. Currently, I play Age of Empires 4. I want to learn this a bit, but it's kind of difficult. Also maybe some fighting games, and whatever comes up I like. But yeah, I think that's basically where you can find my stuff. Shout out also to the mods and to the chat. It was really nice here. And to Robert, of course, for inviting me. It was an honor to be here and discussing law with you for over 3 hours already, almost 4. So, but usually, everything goes longer when I'm there. So I'm a bit, maybe it's my fault for going this long. Sorry for that.
This was an absolute pleasure having you on. As I say, the honor was all mine. I highly recommend that you go and check out the Philosopher's Game. There's a link down in the description below. If you're watching live, it'll be wherever the chat is. Thank you so much, Chris. I hugely appreciated this. You brought a huge amount of knowledge and enthusiasm to this subject. So thank you very much for that. Mara Lee, thank you. Just spotted that going through, sending love for all the content. Mara, thank you. A huge thank you to you for all of your support, not just to me, but to many other content creators as well. Thank you. I hugely appreciate that. Let me just make you disappear for one moment. If you are watching this back a little bit later, then appearing somewhere around here will be a link to other live streams. Appearing somewhere around here will be a link to my Patreon page, Patreon being the best way to support this channel if you so wish. Thank you so much again, Chris. Next week, we will be coming back with a live stream about The Witcher Season 2 coming up very soon. I'll have the podcast as a prize on, so I'd love to see you all there. Take care, everyone, and I will see you again soon.